Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when sleeping behind thick stone walls wasn't just about feeling cozy, it was about staying alive. You're standing at the foot of a castle, not a fairy tale one with swans and velvet. This one looms. A hulking stone giant perched at the top of a steep, uneven hill, casting shadows that swallow the valley whole. If you squint, you can almost see the tiny figures of archers pacing the upper walkways, or the glint of a helmet catching the last light of day. You shift your feet. The earth is damp and sloped, and already you're starting to feel what most medieval invaders felt the moment they looked up. Dread. Because that's the first piece of genius you'll discover tonight. Location. Castles weren't dropped randomly into the landscape like chess pieces. They were chosen, designed, elevated, every stone placed higher than you'd want to climb, on cliffs, rocky spurs, hilltops, anywhere that made assault difficult and vision long. Think of Dover perched on its white cliffs, or Château de Chinon, wrapped along a narrow ridge. High ground meant control. But it wasn't just the view. No. Gravity was part of the weaponry. A steep approach slowed attackers, tired them out, forced them into narrow paths where they could be rained on with arrows or boiling oil. Some castles even had false roads leading to dead ends. Imagine panting your way up a hillside under fire, only to realise you're cornered. You won't believe this, but some of those routes were made just slippery enough to cause a stumble in metal boots. Alright, before you get too cosy, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe, but only if your heart says yes. And hey, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight and what time is it where you are? Dim the lights, get that fan going for some background vibes, and let's chill into tonight's little adventure. Now look around you again. The castle's entrance isn't even visible yet. Instead, you see the outer curtain wall wrapping the hill like a stone serpent, unbroken and thick. It's not smooth either. There are jagged boulders piled along its base, remnants from earlier landslides, or maybe from earlier sieges. There's something quiet here. Not peaceful exactly, more like patient. You start walking, and your boots crunch over crushed gravel. Somewhere beneath the surface, the foundation of the castle goes deep. It has to. These giants weren't just built up, they were anchored. Foundations could extend meters into the rock, carved by hand with chisels and sheer endurance. And here's something curious. Some castles were built using local stone not for ease, but for psychology. The stone made them belong to the hill, look like they had grown from it. In Wales, grey slate made walls blend into misty skies. In parts of France, pale limestone made castles glow under the moonlight. One English lord even chose a darker, stone, because he said it troubled the spirit of those who looked too long. As you climb slowly upward, you start to notice the silence isn't total. There's the faint flap of a banner high above, and the echo of something metal. A portcullis chain maybe, or just your nerves imagining it. Either way, the castle hasn't even tried to stop you yet. That comes later. For now, its location does all the talking. You reach a bend in the path where the view opens up behind you. The valley spreads out, dotted with fields, cottages and trees. From here, a lookout could see every movement for miles, every merchant's cart, every distant plume of dust. You realise this place wasn't just made to survive attacks. It was made to own the landscape. You press forward, and the path grows steeper, narrower. The incline isn't just tiring, it's calculated. Every extra breath you take would have been one more weakness exposed if you were carrying a spear and shield. You're walking the same route once trodden by invaders who never made it home, merchants who bargained for protection, and messengers who knew better than to dawdle. The hill is part of the castle's memory, and it remembers every footstep. Ahead, the first wall emerges. Not the main fortress, not yet, but the outer curtain. It's not flat like a city wall. No, this one curves, bending gently in and out, creating angles known as flanking positions where archers could strike you from the sides. That elegant bend wasn't for beauty. It was a killing field. The wall's height varies too. Lower near the path to lure you in, higher in the distance to keep you wondering how deep the defences go. You pause beneath it, dwarfed. The stone is cold and rough, full of embedded fossils and lichen. Some castles were built so long ago that time itself became part of their structure. There's a carved stone jutting out, weathered by centuries of rain with initials barely visible. A mason's mark? Or maybe a prank from a bored stonemason who etched his name for future travellers like you. Not everything in a castle was deadly. Some parts were just human. Now look to your right. There's a flattened patch of land. Not much to notice, unless you know what you're seeing. It's a mustering yard. Troops would gather here before storming out or standing ready in parade formation for a visiting lord. But in siege times, it became something else. A kill zone. If an enemy ever breached the outer wall, they'd be trapped here, surrounded from above by defenders hidden behind battlements. And here's a twisted detail you won't find in storybooks. Some castles purposefully left one or two outer sections weaker, just enough to tempt attackers into breaching there. Why? Because once inside, they'd be funneled into a narrow area where boiling pitch or flaming arrows could do their work more efficiently. Brutal, but effective. You finally glimpse the true castle behind the walls. It doesn't look friendly. No windows at ground level, no signs of life. Just another wall behind this one, another slope, another gate, and beyond that, who knows? This isn't a place that lets you see everything at once. It's a fortress of concealment. But as the sun lowers behind the hills, the stone begins to change colour. Greys turn blue, then lavender, then almost gold where the light lingers. The shadows stretch, and the castle softens, not in purpose, but in mood. For a moment it feels less like a machine of war and more like a sleeping animal, ancient and dignified, curled atop its hill. And you're still outside. You think back to that moment in the valley when you first looked up and saw this place towering above you. Back then it was just a shape. Now every step has peeled it open like a puzzle. The slope, the blind curves, the false paths, the flanking points, none of it accidental. It's not just the size that intimidates, it's the intentionality. This is a place designed not just to stop you, but to think ahead of you. Every angle, every inch of terrain has been turned into a defensive asset, and you haven't even reached the front gate yet. Tomorrow, maybe we'll see what happens when you try to cross the moat. You take a breath and step closer. The air shifts. There's a heaviness now, a damp chill that settles around your ankles like it crept up from the earth itself. Before you, the ground levels out into something unexpected. A wide, dark trench encircling the outer curtain wall like a scar around a wound. It doesn't shimmer or sparkle like in fairy tales. There are no swans, no delicate bridges with flower boxes. What you see is a moat, and it is not welcoming. From this angle it looks bottomless, but it isn't the depth that makes your stomach twist. It's what might be in there. You peer closer. The water's surface is murky and still, but in some spots it ripples faintly, like something moved beneath. Is that just the wind, or something older? Most people think moats were just ditches filled with water, passive obstacles meant to slow invaders, but they were far more sinister than that. In their prime, some were stocked with sharp stakes just beneath the surface. Others, in the worst sieges, were seeded with garbage, animal carcasses, even sewage, to spread disease and break enemy morale. If an enemy soldier slipped into one, they didn't just drown, they rotted there, their body a warning to the next wave. But what really makes you pause is the bridge. It stretches before you, narrow and wooden, raised at the far end. A drawbridge. Right now, it's lowered, but you can still see the thick chains, the iron-rimmed winch posts beside the gatehouse. One tug, and that bridge could snap upward, leaving you stranded on a tiny strip of land, a perfect target. You imagine the sound it would make. Groaning timber, clanking iron, a final slam, and how quickly the space beneath your feet would turn from path to trap. You start to cross. The wood creaks under your steps, not loudly, but just enough to remind you that this is borrowed time. On either side, the moat laps quietly, and you catch a whiff of something unpleasant. Stagnant water, maybe worse. During long sieges, castle defenders sometimes dumped chamber pots into the moat. Yes, human waste. Why? Because hygiene wasn't high on the priority list, and because, frankly, the smell was a weapon too. This wasn't a swimming pool. This was psychological warfare. At the halfway point, you notice a strange groove running down the centre of the bridge, just wide enough for a wheel. It's worn into the wood like it's been there for centuries. Siege carts, perhaps. Or something heavier. Maybe a mobile battering ram that never quite made it to the gate. One lord in Eastern Europe once reinforced his bridge with iron spikes on the underside. Not to protect from enemies, but to puncture boats trying to approach from beneath. You can't help but glance down. There's no boat. You're nearly across now. The outer wall looms directly above, its battlements peeking over like stern eyebrows. Above the gate you spot the openings. Murder holes. Not just for arrows, but for boiling oil, pitch, or even heated sand. Hot sand. It clings to armour, slides into joints, and cooks the wearer from the inside. If you were storming this place, this bridge would be your worst nightmare. But tonight, it welcomes you. Just barely. As you reach the end of the drawbridge, you instinctively glance behind you. That narrow path suspended over brackish water now feels incredibly vulnerable. One pull of a chain and snap, you'd be cut off completely, left to swim or die. You're beginning to understand. Every step you've taken so far was allowed, not granted. Before you is the gatehouse. Not just a doorway, it's a machine. A defensive masterpiece carved from stone and iron. It rises above you like a clenched fist, with layered battlements, towers on either side, and those telltale rectangular openings high above, where defenders could fire, pour, or simply observe. This is no gentle entry. It's a funnel, and you're walking right into its throat. Beneath your feet the ground becomes stone, smooth in places, chipped in others. You notice thin iron grooves just outside the threshold, the portcullis tracks. Most castles had not one but two, even three portcullises in succession. These weren't just gates, they were traps. One slammed down behind you, the other ahead, trapping you in a stone box. No escape, and from above, the murder holes waited. Inside the gatehouse tunnel, your voice wouldn't even echo. It's strangely muffled, silent. That's part of the design too. Some gatehouses were engineered with acoustics in mind, so attackers couldn't coordinate, couldn't hear commands, couldn't even scream for help. And the walls? Look closer. Narrow slits, vertical, with a slight outward flare. Arrow loops. Defenders could fire into the passageway from side chambers you can't even see. So while you're trying to batter down the inner gate, bolts come whistling from the walls, death with no clear source. But here's something even stranger. Some castles had fake entry tunnels, blind corridors that looked promising but led nowhere. Others had trapdoors in the ceiling that could be opened to drop boulders, boiling tar, or worse, animal carcasses soaked in disease. Yes, really. In one French siege, defenders dropped rotting horse parts onto invaders stuck in the gate tunnel. The goal wasn't just to stop them, it was to make them panic, to humiliate them, to turn bold men into sobbing wrecks. And while all that was happening above, defenders moved freely between chambers. Many gatehouses included hidden stairwells and overhead walkways, so soldiers could reposition without exposing themselves. If you tried to storm this space, you'd be fighting not just gravity and stone, but an enemy you couldn't even see. There's a sudden gust of wind from behind, and it carries the smell of the moat again, earthy, damp, slightly foul. But mingled with it is something else. Warm smoke. A cooking fire, maybe. Somewhere deeper. Inside the castle, someone's roasting something. Bread. Meat. It reminds you this place wasn't just a war machine. It was a home. People lived here. They ate, laughed, shouted across courtyards, practiced their aim from these same murder holes when they were boys. Still, this moment, standing here under the gatehouse alone, makes you feel very small. There's a final door ahead, heavy, studded, and thick. It's slightly ajar. Behind it you glimpse a courtyard, dimly lit, with stone buildings rising like giants in the mist. You've crossed the moat, made it through the gatehouse, and stepped into the belly of the beast. But remember, everything you've seen so far was just the first line of defense. You haven't even met the inner wall. You step through the final door and into the outer courtyard. The gate closes behind you with a sound that makes your stomach tense, an old grumbling thud that seems to echo through your ribs. You're inside now, but this doesn't feel like relief. It feels like being watched, and you are. The courtyard is wide, open yet oddly cramped. Stone buildings hug the interior of the outer curtain wall, storehouses, stables, maybe a blacksmith tucked into a corner. Above you, figures move along the wall walk. They don't wave, they don't call down, they just watch, like they're waiting to see what you'll try next. And that's because you have only just entered the first trap. Welcome to the gatehouse's final trick, the killing yard. It's deceptively calm here, quiet, almost still. But look closer. There are no trees, no corners to hide in, and the walls curve inward, drawing you toward the next structure, the inner gate. Every angle of stone around you is sloped or angled for one reason: to give defenders above the perfect vantage to hit you from any direction. You think you're moving forward, but you've already lost. Now your eyes land on the second gatehouse. It's shorter than the first, but thicker, more brutal. This is the true entry to the inner bailey, the heart of the castle. But you're not getting there easily. Let's talk strategy. Most medieval castles didn't rely on one big door to guard their secrets. Instead, they layered them, concentric defences, one inside another, like a stone onion with an attitude problem. You've already passed the outer wall and the moat. Now you're inside a tight, controlled space designed to trap, confuse and delay. If this were a siege, you'd be vulnerable to archers, crossbowmen, boiling water, even the occasional bag of wasps. Yes, wasps. One 13th century account describes defenders releasing nests onto attackers to spark chaos. You can't make that up. But there's another psychological trick here. False progress. You've gotten past the first gate, right? You've crossed the moat. Shouldn't that feel like a win? That's exactly what the castle wants you to think. Because here's the twist. This courtyard is actually worse than the outside. Out there you could run. You had options. But in here, you're hemmed in. Narrow sight lines, slippery cobbles, and worst of all, you're standing in what defenders called a death box, a space with no roof, yet surrounded by firing points on three sides. If the defenders pulled the alarm now, you'd be cooked within minutes. You move forward cautiously. Your feet echo slightly now on the stone. You can feel the slope again, another subtle incline forcing you uphill, making you work just to approach the next threshold. You notice grooves in the paving stones beneath your boots, Not random wear, but deliberate channels to drain water and blood. It starts to dawn on you that every surface here had a purpose. Every wall, ledge, hole, angle, designed by someone who spent years thinking, how can I make this place harder to take? This second gatehouse doesn't look inviting either. It crouches at the far end of the courtyard like a wolf, low and muscular. Its portcullis is up for now, but the thick wooden doors behind it are shut tight, banded with black iron and studded with bolts the size of your palm. You're not inside yet. You're not even close. You approach the second gatehouse, and something subtle changes. The air tightens, the light fades slightly, and even the birds seem to quiet above the walls. This is not the kind of passage you stroll through. It's one you survive. Unlike the first gatehouse, which towered to impress and intimidate, this one feels different. Compact, focused, surgical. Its walls are thicker, not just to withstand battering, but to house a secret. Layered defense within the walls themselves. You're not just facing a door, you're entering a labyrinth of control. You step under the portcullis, its iron teeth arched above like a jaw frozen mid-bite. The tunnel is short, no more than 10 steps, but it's enough. Narrow slits appear again on both sides, angled to fire inward. You glance around. No one's in sight, but you know they could be behind those walls, arrows nocked, just waiting for an order. Then you spot it. Another portcullis, and just beyond that, another. 3 layers. If this castle were under siege, those would drop in sequence, sealing you inside like meat in a grinder. And here's something grotesquely clever. The floor beneath you dips ever so slightly in the centre. It was designed to flood. If the moat water was diverted, yes, some castles had hidden channels, you'd be standing in a rising pool, boxed in and soaking wet, cold, trapped, terrified. And the ceiling? Stone, yes, but pocked with square holes, smaller than the last ones, just big enough for hot sand, stones, or even quicklime to be dumped down. Quicklime, that caustic powder that burned flesh and blinded enemies. It wasn't always oil and fire. Sometimes the most painful weapons were the quietest ones. The door ahead groans open. You step forward into the inner bailey, the core of the fortress. Immediately everything feels more lived in. There are signs of people here. Smoke from a chimney, the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer, chickens scratching at a doorway, and yet the defences don't let up. The buildings are still stone, but here they stand taller, closer together, forming a tighter defensive circle. Every window above you is narrow, every door reinforced. You're in what some called the keep yard, where the last line of defence begins, and the castle's most valuable people lived. You glance back at the gate you just passed through, and it looks so small now. Just a slit in the wall. But you realise what made it brilliant wasn't size. It was control. Every castle gatehouse was a puzzle, built to slow, break, and expose invaders, to test their patience, then punish it. And here's a quirky twist. Some gatehouses had intentionally confusing floor plans. If attackers somehow burst through, they'd find themselves in small courtyards with misleading doors, stairs that led nowhere, and blind corners that turned out to be arrow nests. In one castle in Wales, a spiral staircase behind the second gate led directly back outside. That's right. Attackers could run in circles while the defenders above had a front row seat to the chaos. You can almost hear them laughing, and yet, despite all the fear, you can't help but admire the sheer brilliance. These weren't random stacks of stone, they were machines, masterpieces. Every hinge, every beam, every groove meant to delay, frustrate, trap, and if needed, destroy. But not tonight. Tonight, they let you in. The inner bailey greets you with a strange stillness. You've crossed the moat, survived the gatehouses, and passed through killing yards designed to break even the boldest invaders. And now, here in the heart of the castle, you'd expect peace, maybe even safety. But instead, it feels tighter, more controlled, the kind of calm that makes you instinctively glance over your shoulder. What you're walking into now is a place within a place. The inner defences, the true castle. What came before, that was just an outer shell, meant to slow the enemy down. This is where the castle's real strength lives. Look around. The walls here aren't just thicker, they're doubled. Welcome to the genius of concentric fortification. Instead of relying on a single ring of walls, the architects of the best medieval castles stacked them in layers, one inside another. Like the layers of an onion, or, if you're unlucky, a cage. You stand now between the inner and outer walls. This space has a name, the ward or intervallum. On paper, it looks like an open courtyard. In practice, it's a carefully engineered killing field. If attackers breached the outer curtain, they'd enter here thinking they were inside. But no, they were still exposed, from above, from behind, from both sides. And then the second wall waited. You notice how the walls rise in staggered levels. That's not decorative, it's elevation control. The inner walls were built higher than the outer ones, so defenders on the inner ramparts could shoot over their comrades on the outer wall. Imagine the chaos of a siege. 2 layers of archers firing in synchronized rhythm, raining death from 2 heights at once. It wasn't just deadly, it was beautiful, in a terrifying way. And those towers spaced along the walls, not just lookout posts, they were set at intervals to create flanking fire, angled shots that could catch attackers in their blind spots. One soldier even wrote that entering the space between walls was like stepping into the eye of a spider's web. That's exactly how it was meant to feel, but there's something even smarter. The walls weren't perfectly circular or square. They were broken, bent at strange angles. Why? To create dead zones, spaces where attackers couldn't hide, where every corner funneled them into open view. If you stood in one of those corners, you'd feel it, the full exposure. No shelter, no mercy. You pause beneath one of the towers. It leans out slightly, just enough that if someone above wanted to pour boiling water, they could hit the base directly. And here's the eerie part. Some castles didn't just use hot liquids, they installed built-in cauldrons. Massive iron pots set into stone hearths along the battlements, always ready to heat oil or tar. And when supply ran low, they boiled urine, because when it's hot enough, anything becomes a weapon. You step forward, and the walls close in again. The path now twists. Not straight, never straight. Because a direct path would be a gift to the enemy. These angled corridors force you to turn your body, reveal your flank, slow your step, one turn after another, until you feel like the stone is toying with you, and it is. As you round the final bend in the inner courtyard, something clicks into place. The walls, the staggered towers, the confusing angles. They weren't just meant to block or resist. They were designed to predict you, to lure you in, exhaust you, make you hesitate, then strike from where you'd least expect. Now pause and look up. From this vantage you can finally see both walls at once, the outer curtain behind you and the inner curtain ahead, like jaws slowly closing. It's not hard to imagine the chaos of a real siege here. Arrows raining from both sides, smoke stinging your eyes, defenders shouting from the ramparts while attackers screamed beneath them. And through all of it, the walls held. Stone, perfectly mortared, unmoved by panic or fire. Here's something you probably wouldn't guess. Many castles built in this style weren't built all at once. The concentric design was a response to new threats, particularly the rise of trebuchets and other powerful siege engines. Earlier castles had simple keeps and single walls, but as technology advanced, so did architecture. Kings like Edward III of England pioneered the concentric model at places like Beaumaris and Caerphilly, not just to intimidate, but to anticipate the next assault. These castles weren't just static structures, they were evolving machines. And speaking of evolution, take a look at the wall walk above you. See those battlements? Not just for cover. The spaces between them, called crenelles, weren't evenly spaced. Some were wider, some narrower, depending on the expected line of attack. Even the crenellation pattern could be customized. One French fortress used alternating gaps wide enough for two archers to shoot side by side. Another left tiny teardrop openings called loopholes, specifically for crossbows. You notice something now. The stone beneath your feet is smoother here, more worn, not from attackers, but from daily patrols. Guards pacing the same route day after day, boots polishing the path with repetition. You can almost hear their murmured complaints, the clang of spears knocking against armour, the creak of leather straps under weight. And here's a fun little fact. Some castles built decoy walls. Yes, false inner walls that looked thick and sturdy from afar, but were actually just facades hiding much stronger, hidden structures behind them. A trap for those who thought they'd made progress. Imagine spending days battering down a wall, only to find it led nowhere. You step closer to the inner curtain now. It rises above you like a cliff, sheer and silent. This is the final real barrier before the keep, the castle's core, its brain, its bunker. But even now, it doesn't make the mistake of feeling too secure, because even inside these walls mobility mattered. Narrow walkways wrap around the towers, sometimes doubling back on themselves. You'd think the defenders wanted space to manoeuvre. Instead, they built tight lanes to force invaders to fight single file, while defenders above could stab downward with long spears called guisarmes. And here's where it gets darkly clever. Some castles, especially in Italy and southern France, hid narrow stairwells inside the wall itself. Hollowed out passages only wide enough for one person to pass at a time, ideal for sneak attacks from behind or, in the worst case scenario, a final retreat. You might have walked past one already and never noticed. You reach a wide staircase now, broader than you've seen so far, and realise it leads not to a gate, but to a platform on the wall walk. From there, the entire layout becomes clear. The false courtyards, the uneven towers, the layered defence in every direction. It's like standing inside a chessboard built from stone. And the final move still lies ahead. You ascend the broad staircase slowly, one stone step at a time, your fingers brushing the cold wall for balance. There's a rhythm to the climb, each step slightly taller than the last, just enough to make your thighs burn. Another clever trick. Invaders weighed down with armour would tire quickly here, their movement sloppy by the time they reached the top. But you're light, curious, unarmed, just a traveller with good timing. At the top, you reach the wall walk, or chemin de ronde. It stretches along the inner curtain wall like a narrow balcony, just wide enough for a man and his longbow. A low parapet rises along the edge, its surface broken by a repeating pattern. Block, gap, block, gap. You already know what these are. Crenelles for shooting, merlons for hiding. Together they form the castle's most iconic silhouette, the battlement. Now lean out just a little, carefully, and peer through one of the gaps. The view is breathtaking. Below, the inner bailey spreads out like a stony puzzle, every building oriented with precision. Beyond that, the outer wall curls around the moat, then the hillside, then the vast countryside beyond. From here, you can see for miles, And suddenly, you understand. This isn't just a place of protection, it's a place of surveillance. And that brings us to one of the most subtle but devastatingly effective parts of castle design, the arrow slit. They're everywhere, cut into the walls like narrow vertical scars. You saw a few earlier, but from up here, you realize how many there are. Some are tiny, barely wide enough to slip a finger through. Others are long, tapering cross shapes, and each one has a different purpose. You step closer to one now, an unassuming slit in the stone wall. You lean in and place your eye against it. The outside world narrows to a slice. But move your head slightly, and something strange happens. You can see far to the left, then far to the right. It's all about the angle. These aren't just cracks in the wall. They're inverted keyholes carved to widen inward. From the outside, they're nearly invisible. From the inside, they offer an archer a devastating field of fire. But here's the twist. Some arrow slits weren't even used for arrows. In one Bohemian castle, a series of vertical slits were used purely to listen. When pressed close, the stone-funneled sound from outside. The sentry could hear approaching footsteps long before the eye could confirm it. A sort of 13th century listening device, quietly brilliant. And then there's the shape. Some slits are tall and straight. Others are shaped like crosses, allowing a crossbow to tilt vertically or horizontally. A few are round-topped, built to accommodate early firearms when gunpowder began to enter the picture. These adaptations didn't just appear overnight, they evolved slowly, as each generation of defenders learned from the last. This castle was always learning. As you walk the wall, you spot a small alcove with a bench. Well, it looks like a bench, but on closer inspection it's too narrow to sit on. You press your hand to it and realize it's warm. A flue. Hidden heating, channeling warmth up from the fires below to keep sentries from freezing stiff in winter. Imagine standing guard here in January, icy wind tearing across the parapets, knowing a small warmth crept through the stone just beneath your feet. Cozy, if you're on the inside. You continue your walk along the battlements, feeling the wind lift through the open crenels and brush against your face. It's not the violent gusts of the outer wall, it's calmer here, channeled by the angles of the stone. Another quiet innovation. Even the wind was used to an advantage. Towers were often positioned so that prevailing breezes would carry smoke from within the castle outward and away from defenders. Not just for visibility, but to deny the enemy the telltale signs of fire and movement. Up ahead, the walkway narrows slightly, pressed between a tower and a sheer drop. On the tower wall, you spot something odd. A set of tiny iron loops embedded into the stone just beneath one of the arrow slits. You crouch down. The metal's rusted but still firm. These were tie-down points, used to anchor the legs of tripod-mounted crossbows or swivel hooks for heavier weapons. Some even secured lanterns for nighttime patrols. It's the little details that remind you, this wall walk wasn't for ceremony. It was a living, breathing defensive line. Suddenly a burst of birds rises from a far-off tower. Crows, startled by something you can't see. You freeze. For a moment you feel what it must have been like for a real sentry here centuries ago. Alone, watching, waiting for that one movement in the tree line, that one flicker of light on armour that meant everything was about to change. You rest your hand against the inner parapet and peer through another arrow slit, one positioned not outward, but inward, aimed toward the courtyard below. Why? Because defence wasn't just about outside threats. Rebellion could come from within. A riot in the bailey, a spy in the kitchens, a desperate servant with a torch. Arrow slits faced both ways. Not everyone inside the castle was always welcome, and now comes the part no one tells you about, the downside. These ingenious slits, so perfect for warfare, were also miserable for the men who used them. The narrow view left them blind to danger from other angles. Smoke from their own weapons choked the enclosed space, and if you ever dropped your bow or arrow inside the slit, there was no retrieving it mid-siege. Some slits even became blocked over time, as birds nested in them, or debris fell in during storms. That's when castle architects got sneaky. In some castles, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, slits were designed with angled drainage grooves carved into their base, not for rain, but to flush out bird nests, mud, and other obstructions, with poured water. Maintenance under siege, because you couldn't afford a blind spot. You move on and find a small staircase spiralling down inside a turret. It leads to a platform just beneath the battlement. From here, you see a different kind of slit, shorter, wider, set just above knee height. These weren't for bows, they were for voice. A commander could shout orders from here to the troops below without exposing his upper body. Communication without risk. Imagine bellowing across a courtyard under fire and still being shielded from every arrow. And here's the quirky detail of the night. In one castle in northern Spain, the slits were designed to amplify voices when shouted into from the right angle, almost like a primitive megaphone. You didn't just defend with arrows, sometimes your voice was the weapon. The wind shifts again. Dusk settles heavier now, soaking into the stone and turning the world blue. The arrow slits around you become shadows, eyes, watching both directions. And you remember, walls don't just keep danger out, they also keep secrets in. The air is different here. You've descended from the wall walk, stepped off the battlements, and now find yourself deep inside the castle's main body. The stone feels warmer here, less wind, fewer open gaps. But what you're about to enter next is both ordinary and extraordinary. A simple spiral staircase. Or so it appears. You place your foot on the first stone step. It's worn smooth in the centre, dished from centuries of use. The walls close in immediately. There's no handrail, no torch, just a coiling tunnel of stone that seems to swallow you whole as you begin the climb. But don't be fooled. This staircase is one of the most strategic weapons ever built into medieval fortifications. First, notice the direction. Clockwise. Nearly every castle spiral stair spirals up to the right. That's not a design quirk, it's intentional combat engineering. In a time when almost all swordsmen were right-handed, attackers storming upward would find their sword hand trapped against the central column, unable to swing freely. Defenders descending the stairs, on the other hand, had their sword hand open to the outer wall, with more room to strike. You take a few more steps and begin to feel it. The tight turns, the dizzying pitch, the uneven rise of each tread, some tall, some shallow. That wasn't laziness. That was another tactic. Attackers charging up in heavy armour would stumble, misstep, lose rhythm. Meanwhile, defenders who knew the pattern could retreat with balance and precision. You pause halfway up. The air is damp here, tinged with something earthy. Old dust and damp wool. You press your hand against the inner column. It's solid, thick enough to stop a catapult stone. In some castles, this core was hollowed out to conceal hidden ladders or narrow escape shafts. One famous Norman castle even used its central stair column as a last resort tunnel down to a spring-fed well. And here's something wonderfully weird. Some staircases were built with false steps, just one or two in the entire climb, slightly taller or tilted forward, designed to trip up someone running at full speed. You'd never notice it casually, but in panic, with blood pounding in your ears and shouts behind you, one wrong step and down you go, taking the rest of your squad with you like a pile of armoured dominoes. You reach a landing now. It opens into a small chamber with slits in 3 directions. You could hold off a dozen men from here if you had to, or close the door and vanish. These defense rooms were hidden throughout the staircase systems, places to regroup, reload, or deliver a last surprise to anyone who got too confident. And let's not forget sound. In a spiral stairwell, footsteps echo oddly. The stone amplifies noise from below, but muffles noise from above, meaning the defenders always knew how close the enemy was, but the enemy had no idea what was waiting around the next turn. You step back onto the stairs and keep climbing. Your legs ache now, not because you're weak, but because that's the point. Spiral staircases weren't just vertical halls, they were exhaustion machines. If someone made it to the top, they weren't just winded, they were rattled, disoriented, vulnerable, and you haven't even reached the keep yet. The spiral tightens as you ascend, each turn narrower, the ceiling lower. The torchlight behind you fades, swallowed by the curve of the stone, until only a sliver of light filters from above. You count your steps, though you lose track somewhere around 30, maybe 40. That's another trick. These stairs aren't built to be remembered, they're built to disorient. And now another thought creeps in. What if you weren't allowed to take this climb? Imagine rushing up in full mail, sword drawn, breath coming hot and shallow, only to be met by a defender halfway down the stair, calm, waiting, positioned just above eye level, with a spear aimed at your throat. There's no room to dodge, no place to hide. The very design of the staircase grants them the advantage of height, balance, and direction. But then you spot something. A door carved flush into the outer wall. It's so subtle you would have passed it if not for the slight draft. You push it open, and a rush of air hits your face. You've exited onto a mid-level parapet, a kind of secret platform halfway up the tower. From here, you can fire down into the courtyard or into the very staircase you just climbed. It's called a stair trap station. Some castles had these tucked in like snares, where defenders could ambush attackers within the staircase. A stone the size of a loaf of bread dropped from this height wouldn't just wound, it would kill, especially in a confined space. You step back inside and continue upward. The walls feel closer now. A sudden bump. One step juts out more than the others, a false tread. You smile grimly. They weren't myths after all. These stairs are a puzzle you solve with your feet. Now you hear it. Voices. Muffled, distant, but real. Not invaders. Servants, likely, from within the keep above. You're close now. At last the staircase opens into a great circular chamber. High stone ceiling, thick wooden beams, a small hearth crackling in the centre. This is a guard room, a place where defenders could rest between watches. But it also serves a more critical role. It's the last staging point before reaching the keep's inner heart. From here, several staircases branch off. Some lead upward toward the solar, the Lord's private quarters. Others descend into hidden cellars. One narrow stair, almost invisible in the shadows, winds downward to what was once an escape tunnel, now collapsed and sealed. And here's a quirky historical footnote. In at least one castle in Ireland, the spiral stairs reverse direction halfway up. That's right. Clockwise below, counterclockwise above. Why? Legend says the Lord was left-handed and wanted the advantage from both sides. Whether that's true or just clever folklore, the architecture remains, and no one could figure out why the invaders kept tripping at the midpoint until it was too late. You walk to the window now, deep set, narrow, but with a sweeping view. From here the castle looks almost peaceful. The concentric walls, the arrow slits, the moat far below. It all feels so quiet. But you've seen it differently now. You know the trap in every step, the fight baked into every brick. The spiral staircase was never just a way up. It was a test of balance, of memory, of stamina, a gatekeeper without a face, and it let you pass. Barely, You descend a narrow corridor now, branching away from the tower's central spine. The stone walls feel rougher here, less ceremonial. Gone are the crisp, defensive lines of battlements and crenels. What lies ahead is something far more intimate. The floors slope slightly downward, and the air begins to grow warmer, heavier, with the faintest scent of charred wood and iron. You've reached the service level, the guts of the castle. And with it comes one of the most cunning, least talked about elements of medieval defence. The everyday things that could kill you just as effectively as a blade. You pass under a low arch and step into a long shadowy hallway. On one side, a recessed alcove opens into what looks like a storage area. Wooden barrels stacked in a pyramid, tightly sealed with waxed cloth. On the other, a low set of steps leads to a chamber blackened with soot. This is the boiling room. Yes, boiling, but not for food. This was where castle defenders prepared one of their simplest, cheapest and most effective weapons: scalding water, or oil if the lord could afford it, but often just brine, soup stock or sewage. Anything that burned or reeked when hurled down from a murder hole. And guess what? These weren't just tossed from above with a shout, they were piped. That's right. Some castles had built-in channels connecting this chamber to the gatehouse murder holes. A system of stone gutters carved into the walls, sloping downward toward openings, like plumbing, but for pain. You move past the boiling room and into a narrow hallway lined with what seem like innocuous tiles, but a sharp eye would notice they're not flat. They slope subtly downward toward the middle of the corridor. A drainage channel, not for rain, for blood. This corridor, tucked behind the kitchens and workshops, doubled as a trap hall. In an emergency, servants could pull levers that dropped wooden barriers, turning the space into a narrow death corridor. Oil or fire could be funneled down it. One 14th century castle in Germany even lined its version of this passage with shelves of hornets' nests, which, when struck, would unleash a cloud of stinging chaos into an enclosed tunnel. You'd run, if you could even see straight. And then, underfoot, a change in texture. You pause. The stones here are loose, shifting slightly beneath your step. One clacks differently. You step back and inspect it. A pressure plate? Possibly. It could trigger a hidden weight drop. A simple trap involving stones tied to ropes, hung over doorways, waiting to fall with just a nudge. All of this in a hallway behind the kitchens. See, the genius of castle defence wasn't just in the towers and turrets. It was in places you'd never expect. Stairwells, storerooms, even floors. They were armed, not with swords, but with designs that turned the entire structure into a living trap. And the defenders, they were trained to use it, not just to fight, but to fight with the building itself. You reach a heavy wooden door now, iron-banded and scarred with use. On its surface you notice small metal studs, an early attempt at fireproofing. Behind it lies something even more dangerous than a boiling pot, the castle's kitchens. Because fire, in a stone castle, was both warmth and threat, and this one was weaponized. You push open the heavy door and step into the castle's kitchen, and just like that, you're somewhere between comfort and catastrophe. At first, it feels familiar. The room is large, warm, echoing with the scent of old smoke and cooked meat long absorbed into the walls. Overhead, thick wooden beams are blackened from centuries of fire. Iron hooks dangle from the ceiling, some still holding twisted chains used to hang cauldrons. A massive hearth dominates one wall, the kind you could roast an entire boar in, or, in lean times, a few dozen pigeons. But this kitchen wasn't just about feeding mouths. In times of siege, it became a defensive node. You walk to the hearth. It's cold now, but you imagine it roaring in the dead of winter, flames licking the back wall, steam hissing off damp firewood. What many forget is that the kitchen was often the most dangerous room in the entire castle, because it was one of the few places with open fire and flammable fuel, and direct vents to other parts of the keep. Some castles even design their kitchens with hidden chutes leading to gatehouses or wall towers. Why? To deliver boiling water and hot sand directly to soldiers above. In at least one Norman castle, a vent beside the hearth was connected to a vertical shaft ending in a murder hole 2 stories up. When war came, the cauldron didn't just feed stew, it fed pain. You cross to a corner of the room and notice a small, unassuming hatch near the floor. You open it. Behind it lies a tunnel no wider than your shoulders. It smells faintly of wood smoke and wet stone. This is a fuel shaft, used to bring up firewood from storage chambers below. But in emergencies, these same shafts could be blocked and lit from below, creating smoke traps that flooded key hallways or staircases with choking heat. Smoke doesn't need to burn you to kill you. It just needs to take your air. And here's the eerie part. Some kitchens were placed intentionally close to access points for this very reason. Kitchens didn't just cook, they smoked out invaders. You walk past a long work table. Deep knife scores still mark the surface, crisscrossed from centuries of chopping. But there's something else. Tiny notches burned into the wood at regular intervals. Not measurement marks, fire warnings. A primitive early system used by head cooks to indicate how hot each side of the table had grown near the hearth. In a siege, even the cooks had their own version of battlefield awareness. A rusted spit lies across a stone counter. You pick it up, heavy, balanced, perfectly sized to slide through the metal bracket set into the fireplace, but just as easily repurposed as a weapon in close quarters. During one infamous siege in Wales, a cook defended the inner hall with a meat spit and a kettle of soup, and lived. Then there's the Fringed Tale. A castle in central France once built its kitchen directly beneath a main hallway, with thin chimneys rising through the floor above. If invaders stormed that hall, defenders could ignite fat-soaked rags in the ovens, then force smoke and fire upward through those floor vents. The hallway became a death trap, no swords needed. You exit the kitchen through a side arch and emerge into a cramped stone passage once used by servants. Narrow, uneven, and damp. The ceiling leaks slightly where mortar has cracked. But this too had a purpose, because in the right hands, even a puddle in the wrong place could be deadly. The passage leads you upward again, but slowly this time, curving gently like the stem of a wine glass. You feel the temperature shift as you climb, cooler but not draughty. The smell of wood smoke lingers, but now it's mingled with something else. Beeswax, old wool, and the faint sharpness of iron polish. At the top of the stairs, a wide doorway opens into the great hall. You pause on the threshold. After all the coils and corridors, the confined stairs and death-box passageways, this room feels enormous, breathtaking even. A vaulted ceiling looms above, supported by massive timber beams blackened with age. Tall, narrow windows let in spears of pale light that slice across the floor like the sun filtering through a cathedral. And just like that, the castle changes its voice. Gone are the whispers of ambush and siege. The great hall speaks a different language: authority, ceremony, power. But don't be fooled, because beneath the banners, beneath the carved stone thrones and polished tables, beneath the clinking of goblets and the roast meat on trenchers, this place was one of the most strategic rooms in the entire fortress. You step inside. At the far end, raised high on a dais, sits the Lord's chair. Not a throne, exactly, but close enough. It's elevated by just 3 steps, but those steps matter. From that chair, the lord or lady could see every face in the room, every gesture, every twitch of a servant's hand. This wasn't just about feasting, it was about control. And here's the genius. The great hall was built with acoustics in mind. Stone arches above and behind the seat helped carry sound, allowing the lord to speak softly and still be heard across the room. And for everyone else, every whisper, every complaint bounced off those same stones and back toward the dais. Privacy didn't exist here. You looked to the walls. Tapestries hang like heavy skin, muffling echoes. But they're more than decoration. In times of cold, they were insulation. In times of tension, they were hiding places for weapons and armour. One hall in Normandy famously had concealed alcoves behind the drapes, guard posts, ready to intervene if a guest grew too bold. You walk past the long feasting table, rough-hewn and scarred from years of elbows, knives and slammed tankards. Each seat has meaning. The closer to the dais, the higher your status. Sit in the wrong place, and you weren't just being rude, you were making a political move. And then there's the ceiling. Not just wood and smoke stains. Look closely and you'll see trapdoors. Yes, actual trapdoors, hidden among the beams. Some halls had lofted walkways above, used by guards to monitor feasts from the shadows. In rare cases, those trapdoors could be opened to drop stones, oil, or nets if things turned violent. This was a feast hall, sure, but it was also a theatre of dominance. Every inch was built to remind guests who was in charge, and to offer the castle's master the upper hand in every scenario. Even celebration could become a siege. You move toward the hearth, the true heart of the great hall. It isn't dainty. It yawns across half the wall, big enough to roast a deer whole, or to swallow a man if someone were feeling particularly dramatic. Thick iron fire dogs hold half-burned logs, and above them the stone mantle is stained with centuries of smoke. This hearth wasn't just for heat, it was for spectacle. Fires in the great hall served as a visual anchor, a literal centre of warmth and life, but also dominance. When the hearth blazed, all attention was drawn toward it. The flickering light cast dramatic shadows across the lord's face on the dais, amplifying presence. Some lords even arranged feasts to coincide with twilight, just so the torchlight would work in their favour. It wasn't just food, it was performance. You pass one of the side alcoves now, a kind of raised gallery. Musicians might have played here during feasts. But in times of crisis, it doubled as an archery post. Loopholes hidden in the walls, ones that no dinner guest would notice, allowed defenders to fire into the great hall if things went south. Because not every siege came from the outside. Sometimes, the danger sat at your own table. You glanced toward the servants' doors, cleverly tucked into the far wall. You'd think they were simple entries to kitchens and storerooms, but in some castles those passages led to entire service corridors, narrow parallel hallways where servants could move unseen, eavesdrop, and carry messages without interrupting the show. It wasn't just about food, it was surveillance. And then, your foot brushes something. You look down, a tiny iron ring embedded in the stone floor, half hidden beneath the edge of an old rush mat. You kneel and tug it upward, revealing a recessed cavity beneath the floorboards. Empty now, but once it might have held a short sword or a vial of poison, or a message meant only for the Lord's eyes. There's a strange, sobering reality here. The grander the hall, the more dangerous it could be. Take, for example, the castle at Housesteads on Hadrian's Wall. Its hall was designed so the light from the fire illuminated only the lord's end of the table, leaving everyone else in half shadow. Another in Burgundy had a narrow side chamber with no purpose, until a rebellion broke out and defenders used it to flank the guests. And in one eerie case in Bohemia, a stone step near the dais could be lifted to reveal a direct tunnel out of the castle. A lord who needed to vanish mid-banquet had only to feign a coughing fit and disappear beneath the table. The wine? It distracted. The fire? It mesmerized. The music? It lulled. And all the while the castle watched. It remembered. And it planned for what came next. You step back from the hearth and glance once more at the lord's chair. Empty now. But in your mind you can still see him there. One hand on the table, the other on a hilt just, out of sight, eyes calm, listening for the faintest hint of betrayal. This wasn't just dinner. This was war by other means. You leave the great hall through a smaller archway tucked behind the dais. It opens into a narrower corridor, dim and hushed. The stone here is older, darker, less polished. Your boots echo a little more loudly. And before long, the warmth of the fire fades behind you. The temperature drops. Welcome to the part of the castle that most guests never saw. You're entering the residential wing, but don't let the word fool you. This isn't luxury. Not in the modern sense. These were living quarters, yes, but also survival chambers. And when winter came, or when siege closed the gates for months on end, they became a test of endurance, planning, and design. You push open a heavy wooden door and find yourself in what once might have been the solar, a private living chamber used by the lord and his family. It's warmer than the rest, barely, thanks to a hearth on the far wall and thick hangings of wool along the stone. A wooden table, rough but sturdy. A window seat, deep and cushioned with old furs. A narrow canopy bed pushed into the corner. This was considered comfort in the medieval world. You wouldn't call it lavish, but in the heart of winter, it was life itself. Because make no mistake, cold was the real enemy. Castles weren't heated from room to room. There were no central fires, no radiators. Warmth had to be held, hoarded, and channeled. That's why these chambers were built along the south-facing wall, wherever possible, to catch the most sunlight. That's why the ceilings were lower, the rooms smaller, and the doors thicker than you'd expect. Heat was a precious thing. You built rooms to trap it. You glance upward and notice something subtle, a vent near the ceiling, slanted downward. That's not a chimney. That's part of a draft control system. Some castles were built with hidden flues behind the walls, tiny shafts that carried warm air from the kitchens or great halls into living chambers. It wasn't central heating, but it was better than nothing. And those tapestries you admired earlier, they weren't decoration. They were insulation, woven from wool or linen, and hung along the walls to stop cold air from creeping through the mortar. In some castles, tapestries were even layered, 2 or 3 deep, and swapped out seasonally. You walk toward the window now. It's narrow and deep set, more like a stone tunnel than a window. The glass, if present at all, is thick and wavy, more decorative than transparent. Most windows were covered with shutters in the winter, fastened with iron hooks from the inside. You'd light your candles at noon just to see your hands. And the bed? Not as inviting as it looks. Tall and narrow, with a wooden canopy not for style, but to trap warmth from your body and breath. People slept curled tightly under layers of furs, linen sheets, and sometimes even straw. In wealthier castles, beds were moved closer to the fire at night. In poorer quarters, people shared sleeping space, multiple, bodies for one pool of warmth. You shiver slightly, not from the cold, but from the awareness that warmth here was earned. Nothing about this castle was built for ease, it was built for survival. And when the night stretched long and food grew scarce, even the thickest tapestries couldn't keep out what came next. You slip through a side door in the solar, and it groans softly on its hinges. On the other side is a corridor even colder than before, long, narrow, with stone walls that sweat in the winter. A single arrow slit at the far end lets in a pale shaft of light. barely enough to see your breath condense in front of you. This part of the castle, it was meant to be endured, not enjoyed. You descend a short flight of stairs and enter what was once a storage room, but during siege, or winter, it became something more, a refuge chamber. Not for guests, not even for servants, but for the family. These tucked-away rooms were lined with heavy trunks, shelves of supplies, and, if the castle was clever, secondary hearths built into the back walls. You can see the blackened stone where one such fireplace still sits. Its chimney disappears into the wall, hidden from outside view to avoid giving away warmth or weakness. This was the castle's internal bunker. Here's a bitter truth. Medieval winters didn't kill with swords. They killed with cold and silence. You imagine what this room would feel like on the 3rd month of a siege, when firewood was dwindling, water was being rationed, and outside the walls, snow covered the corpses of livestock killed too early in desperation. And yet, even then, the castle had design answers. Take the floors beneath your feet. They're stone now, but many castles layered them with reeds or straw mats, both to trap warmth and to absorb moisture. The reeds were changed every few weeks, not because it was hygienic, but because rot meant rats, and rats meant disease. Some wealthier lords installed wooden platforms to elevate sleeping areas just slightly, enough to avoid sleeping on the freezing floor. The difference of a few inches could save a life. You step through another arch and find yourself in a side pantry, no longer used, its shelves empty, but the architecture remains. Stone walls thicker here, with only one tiny ventilation slit. In some castles, these rooms were used to store not food, but heat. Yes, heat. Hot stones were taken from the kitchen fires and placed into metal baskets or braziers inside these small chambers, turning them into medieval space heaters. At night, the baskets were moved into living quarters for warmth, slowly releasing heat through the dark hours. And what about clothing? You imagine people wrapped in heavy wool cloaks, but even those weren't enough during bitter months. That's why castles kept fur-lined mantles, shared between family members like treasured relics. And for the poor souls without such luxury, heated bricks wrapped in cloth, held to the chest while sleeping. Sometimes, just sleeping beside the kitchen wall was considered a gift. But perhaps the most brilliant and often forgotten solution to winter wasn't fabric or fire. It was routine. Castles ran on patterns, morning fires, scheduled movement, rotating sleeping shifts. Activity kept blood moving, minds distracted. Even fear was a kind of heat. One record from a Yorkshire castle noted that during a siege in December, the guards were kept awake not by fear of the enemy, but by orders to sing just to keep the blood flowing. You close your eyes for a moment standing in the empty pantry and listen. There's no singing now, just stone, cold, loyal stone. And through it all the castle endured, not because it was warm, but because it refused to yield. You descend once more, this time down a straight, narrow flight of stairs leading beneath the inner bailey. The walls close in again, the stone damp now, almost sticky. There's no light here but the flicker of a torch left in an iron sconce, its flame guttering as if nervous. You've entered the belly of the castle. This is where the true genius of survival was hidden, not in towers or murder holes, but in food and water. Welcome to the storerooms. The air is cool and heavy with the scent of salt, dried herbs and old wood. Rows of barrels and crates stretch ahead, like the ribs of a sleeping giant. Everything here has been packed with obsessive care. Grain sealed in waxed linen, meat salted until it's almost stone, cheese wrapped in cloth and hung to dry, and more salt. Always more salt. Because in a world without refrigeration, salt was gold. This isn't a kitchen pantry, this is siege planning. A well-prepared castle could store food for months, sometimes a year, if it was carefully calculated. Lords kept ledgers tallying how many mouths they might need to feed. Family, guards, servants, visiting knights, even stonemasons and cooks. Rations weren't generous. A chunk of black bread, dried peas, a bit of cheese if you were lucky. Wine was cut with water, sometimes vinegar. It wasn't about taste, it was about survival math. You brush your fingers over a barrel marked with a strange symbol. 3 vertical lines and a circle. A saltfish cask. This one's empty now, but once it would have held preserved herring or eel, packed so tightly in brine that it could last through 3 winters. Castles near rivers had the edge. Smoked fish, dried riverweed, even pickled frog legs in desperate times. And here's the twist. Some castles kept food not just for people, but for animals. Horses, of course, but also chickens, goats, even bees. Because livestock didn't just provide food, they provided life. Eggs, milk, tallow for candles, and in the case of bees, wax and honey. Both valuable, both durable. You duck beneath a low arch and find yourself in the dry cellar. Here the temperature drops even further. The walls are thickest here, built into the earth, or against the castle's natural rock foundation. This was where the most perishable items were stored. Grains, root vegetables, apples wrapped in straw, even vinegar barrels for preserving unwanted parts of meat. One English castle even buried hollowed-out stones filled with snow in deep cellars to preserve ice into spring. Primitive refrigeration, and proof of just how seriously they took siege survival. But food was only half the battle. The real treasure was water. In the corner of the cellar, hidden beneath a stone slab, lies a small circular opening. A rope once dangled here. You kneel and peer down into the blackness. It's a well, carved directly into the rock and always placed within the inner curtain wall. Some castles even built fake wells outside the gates to lure attackers into wasting time. But this one fed the whole keep. And here's the genius. Many wells were disguised during wartime, covered with barrels sealed with stone, guarded like treasure. Because once the water ran out, the walls might as well have collapsed. You run your fingers around the rim of the well's opening. The stone is worn smooth by centuries of rope and calloused hands. There's a chill rising from the darkness below, damp and ancient, carrying the faint mineral scent of groundwater and time. You can almost hear it, the slow drip of a leak, the faint ripple as the bucket lands, the creak of the pulley wheel groaning as someone hauls it back up. Because when the siege came, and it always came, this well wasn't just vital, it was sacred. Many castles built their wells directly into the bedrock, even digging through dozens of meters of solid stone. Some took years to complete, entire generations of masons labouring for water that defenders might need for only a handful of brutal weeks. But without it, none of the other defences mattered. A brilliant gatehouse, deadly murder holes, thick concentric walls, useless if your soldiers were too thirsty to stand. Some wells, like the one here, were designed with stone cisterns nearby, sealed chambers to collect rainwater from the castle roofs, filtered through gravel and sand. If the enemy poisoned the river or blocked the spring, no problem. The castle had a backup plan, and a backup to the backup. One fortress in Cyprus even installed ceramic pipes beneath the courtyard to gather dew and funnel it into hidden tanks. Dew? That's how carefully they planned. You glance at the ceiling. Above the well is a narrow square hatch, likely connected to the kitchen level above. During a siege, servants could draw water without ever stepping outside, lowering buckets down on rope systems wound through pulleys, sometimes with counterweights made of lead or stone. No need for brute strength, just a bit of cleverness. Now, look to the side of the chamber. See that stack of thick clay jugs? They're sealed with wax and tucked into shelves carved directly into the stone. Those weren't for display. They were emergency stores, small containers of drinking water, vinegar for cleaning wounds, even wine diluted for calories. When invaders cut the supply lines, these jugs were a last whisper of survival. One record from a castle under siege in Alsace mentioned such jugs hidden behind fake walls, so valuable that a single flask was traded for a sword. But it's not just the storage that amazes, it's the discipline. Water was rationed down to the cup. Soldiers were assigned specific hours to draw it. Children weren't allowed near the well. Spillage was punished. In times of siege, water discipline was often more strictly enforced than guard duty. One noblewoman in the 14th century was said to carry the keys to the well around her neck, sleeping with them, bathing with them, refusing to let anyone else touch them. And here's a strange little detail you wouldn't expect. Some castles stored wine in the well, not to drink, but to confuse poisoners. If an enemy agent reached the water and dumped in toxins, the wine, sealed in glass or tightly corked, acted as a control sample. If the wine turned sour, they knew the well was compromised. That's medieval chemistry right there. You take one last look down into the shaft. It's deep, silent, still. In the worst weeks of a siege, people must have come here just to look at it, to know it was still there, that there was still hope. Because without water, the strongest castle wasn't a fortress. It was a tomb. You leave the storerooms behind and follow a narrow corridor that seems to curl inward like a secret. The air grows colder again, but this time it's not the chill of open stone or drafty towers. It's a deeper kind of cold, one that clings to your boots and settles into your chest. You're heading down into the undercroft. The light fades as you descend a tight curved stair carved directly into bedrock. Your footsteps echo strangely here, not sharp but soft, as if the very walls are swallowing the sound. These were the bones of the castle, the low vaulted chambers beneath everything. Storage, yes, but also safety and secrets. At the base of the stair, the corridor opens into a long hall with a vaulted ceiling just low enough to make you duck. The walls are thick, arched, ribbed with age, and lining either side are alcoves, each one dark and recessed like a sunken eye socket. Some held food, others candles, dried herbs, or weapons, but more than a few were used for people. This was where the castle stored not just goods, but prisoners. The air smells different here, less like dust and more like iron and damp wool, the telltale scent of rusting chains and old straw. One of the alcoves still has an iron ring bolted to the floor. You step closer and see scratch marks in the stone. Not deep, just enough to say someone didn't leave willingly. But the Undercroft wasn't always a dungeon. In many castles, these low stone vaults served dual purposes. During siege, they became refuge bunkers, a place to move civilians, valuables, or even the lord's family if the keep was compromised. The thick stone and earth overhead made it nearly bomb-proof, especially in later centuries when gunpowder entered the picture. And then there's the acoustics. You try a small sound, a tap on the wall with your knuckle. It doesn't echo. It disappears. These undercrofts were acoustically dead, a place where voices didn't carry, footsteps didn't travel, screams didn't leave. In one Scottish castle, a secret cell was discovered centuries later, behind a false wall, completely sealed, soundproofed by the natural curve of the rock. No one knew it was there until a renovation worker's hammer went hollow. You move toward the centre of the hall and spot a strange object set into the floor. It looks like a drain, but it's surrounded by faint burn marks. A fire pit? Maybe. But more likely it was a coal brazier. used to generate heat in a controlled way during long winters. Some undercrofts were lined with clay tiles to reflect heat. Others used charcoal mounds, kept low and hot but without smoke, because down here, smoke kills. You reach another chamber branching off the main vault. It's smaller, circular, and entirely enclosed. A single slit in the wall lets in a narrow beam of grey light. Along the far wall you notice an odd patch of stone. A door, maybe, sealed shut and aged to match its surroundings. A hidden compartment, possibly, in some castles, undercrofts connected to secret escape tunnels, narrow, collapsed now, but once carved out by hand as a last resort. And here's a haunting truth. During sieges this place would have held everything. The last food, the last weapons, the last people, and sometimes the last choices. You linger a moment longer in the undercroft, letting your eyes adjust to the half-light. There's a weight to this place, not just the physical pressure of earth and stone above, but something older, deeper. You can feel it in the walls, in the way the air moves slowly as if reluctant to disturb the silence. You move deeper into the circular chamber, running your hand along the curve of the wall. It's smoother here, as though worn not by tools but by time. In one corner a narrow shelf has been carved directly into the stone, perhaps once used for candles or documents or something less noble. You imagine a guard posted here in the dark, ears straining for the distant crash of a battering ram or the hiss of a torch being lit too close. But this wasn't just a bunker, it was a final line. During prolonged sieges, when the walls had been breached and the great hall was lost, the undercroft became a last redoubt, a place to make a stand, or a place to disappear. Some castles built false walls in their undercrofts, just a few bricks thick, concealing passageways that led nowhere, or sometimes everywhere. One in Bavaria had 5 different exits, one toward the kitchen, one under the chapel floor, and one that led straight into the base of the moat wall, behind a loose boulder. An entire garrison could vanish, only to reappear where the enemy least expected. You walk back toward the larger vault and pause in front of one of the alcoves. This one's different. There's a tiny square window high up near the ceiling, barred with rusted iron. It lets in just enough light to illuminate what remains of a stone bench and a ring in the wall. A holding cell. You stare at it longer than you'd like to admit. Not every castle was run by fair lords. In some, the undercroft held the dark weight of political prisoners, heirs locked away, rivals forgotten, messengers who said the wrong thing. One castle in the Loire Valley was known to have a secret justice room below its chapel, where interrogations took place under the flickering light of devotional candles, where mercy and stone rarely met. And here's a strange twist of practicality. Some undercrofts doubled as crypts. Not for commoners, of course, but for the lord's lineage. Tombs built into the deepest parts of the keep, both to protect them from desecration and to remind future rulers what lay beneath their throne. Imagine holding out during a siege in the same room where your grandfather was buried. Talk about pressure. You pass another alcove and notice something odd. Grooves carved into the stone floor, forming a shallow channel. At first glance it looks like a drainage path. But then you realize it's a trap groove, designed to catch oil or water and divert it away from stored supplies, or into an enemy's boots if someone poured liquid from above. The undercroft wasn't just a vault, it was a mechanism, always watching, always ready to turn necessity into strategy. And just as you're about to leave, you spot one final detail. A handprint. Faint, worn into the stone at shoulder height. Not carved, rubbed in, over years. A guard's ritual, a prisoner's tally, or maybe just someone reaching for reassurance before stepping back into the darkness. You press your palm to it. It fits. You ascend once more, back into the light, though now everything feels sharper, narrower, The halls above the undercroft seem brighter, not because they are, but because your eyes have adjusted to the dark. And as you climb a tight staircase tucked into the inner wall, you realise you're heading into the most commanding structure of the entire castle, the tower. More than just a lookout, a tower was a message carved in stone. It said, "We see you, we own the sky." You emerge into the base of a round tower, the kind that curves around you like a shield. The air smells different here, drier, a bit musty, with a whiff of ash. Around the edges you see not just windows but embrasures, wide openings designed to allow archers to pivot left and right. From here you could cover nearly the entire bailey with a single bow. The tower spirals upward and you begin the climb. Unlike the staircases in the keep or gatehouse, this one is less cramped. The steps are narrow, yes, but there's space to breathe. And there's a reason for that. These towers weren't just for defense, they were for movement, communications, commands, signals. In the chaos of a siege, someone had to run messages between the walls and the hall, between the keep and the outer gate. That someone ran up here. But this wasn't just a glorified hallway. Each level of the tower had its own function. One landing might hold archery slits, another a guard room with supply crates and a signalling horn. In one corner, you pass a spiral of iron hooks embedded in the wall, used to haul weapons or fuel, or even buckets of boiling pitch to the upper levels. It wasn't elegant, it worked. You climb higher and reach a mid-tower chamber. The floor here is littered with broken slates and the shell of a long-dead pigeon. And that's when it hits you. This wasn't just a lookout. It was a command post. A low stone table dominates the space, carved with a map of the surrounding lands. Faint etchings mark rivers, tree lines, villages. You run your hand over one carved path leading up to the castle. There are tiny notches beside it, like score marks. Someone was keeping count. You step to the arrow slit. From here, the view stretches not just across the outer bailey, but far beyond. Rolling fields, distant roads, maybe even a harbour if this castle stood near the coast. This wasn't just about protection, it was about control, visual, tactical, and psychological. Because to rule a castle wasn't just to survive behind its walls, it was to own the world beyond them. And here's where things get quirky. In some towers, the top floor was not for guards, it was for messenger birds. You heard that right. A pigeon loft hidden above the defenders, where trained birds waited to carry messages across vast territories. Their cages were tucked into the eaves. Special windows were built into the masonry, not too large, not too small, just right for a feathered spy. You can almost hear them fluttering, now even though the room stands silent, and that silence, it holds a strange power. Because in this tower, high above the chaos of hearths and undercrofts, of boiling oil and arrow loops, you're standing in the nervous system of the castle. The place that saw first and spoke fastest. The one that never slept. Even when the rest of the castle could. The stairs wind again, tighter now, as if reluctant to let you higher. Your thighs burn, and your hand drags along the cool stone of the inner wall, tracing the groove worn by generations of sentries, messengers, and lords. Then suddenly you feel a shift in the air, a faint current, colder and sharper than before. You're near the top of the tower. You emerge into a small circular platform, open to the sky, but ringed with high merlons for cover. This is the observation deck, and the moment your head clears the final stair, the world explodes into view. Panoramic, boundless. From here, the castle no longer feels like a place. It feels like a command. You see everything. The twisting road leading up to the outer gate, the slope of the hill below, the winding river beyond. If the castle had farmland, it's all visible now. Patchwork fields, stone fences, smoke rising in wisps from distant cottages. The castle didn't just defend itself, it watched over its territory like a hawk with stone wings. And this place, this high perch, wasn't just for vanity, it was for coordination. Here, signallers stood with flags, lanterns, or even small fires. When night fell, they lit beacons, controlled fires that could be seen from miles away. 1 fire meant a rider was spotted, 2 meant an enemy column, 3 was the alarm, siege. In some parts of England, signal chains stretched castle to castle, capable of spreading a warning across entire counties in a single hour. And yes, there were pigeon lofts just as you suspected. In one corner you spot rusted iron cages now empty, their doors hanging open like crooked mouths. But once, they were home to trained homing pigeons, sent with tiny tubes strapped to their legs. Castles maintained their own flocks, and in times of siege, when roads were blocked and riders intercepted, these birds became the fastest messengers in the kingdom. Here's a fun little twist. One Mediterranean castle painted its pigeons 2 different colours, one for peace, one for war. The enemy never knew which message was flying overhead. Brilliant psychological warfare with feathers. You crouch behind a merlin and look down into the bailey far below. Tiny figures move through the yard, guards changing shifts, a servant hauling firewood, a boy chasing a chicken. From up here, they look like pieces on a game board. And in truth, that's what this tower allowed. The ability to play the board, to shift forces, prepare defences, reposition archers, or open and close gates, all based on what this tower could see. But what if the enemy scaled the walls? What if they reached this height? Then the tower had one more card to play: vertical death. Some towers were built with trap platforms, small hatches that opened over steep drops. Defenders could pour boiling liquids, fire arrows down in safety, or, if desperate, drop stones the size of pumpkins onto heads below. One German castle designed a windlass winch at the top of its main tower to raise and lower cauldrons between platforms, ensuring there was always hot oil at hand, even 80 feet in the air. You look around one last time. The wind bites now, the sky is darkening. But for a moment you see what the Lord saw, what the messenger knew, what the guards swore to protect. This wasn't just a view, it was vision. A castle didn't sleep, it watched, it signalled, it waited. And up here, above all else, it remembered that sight was survival. You descend from the tower, the sky still glowing dimly with the last gold of day, and your boots find stone again, firm, familiar. But as you wind down the narrow inner stairs, a new thought creeps in. What if sight wasn't enough? What if you had to send word beyond the horizon? Back in the main keep, you step into a smaller square chamber just off the central stairwell. It doesn't look like much. Just a simple room with a few shelves, a writing table and an open window high on the wall. But this quiet little space once buzzed with urgency and tension. You found the message room, the nerve centre for medieval communication. And believe it or not, this might be the most underappreciated weapon in the entire castle. You already know about signal fires and pigeons, but here, the process behind those signals becomes real. On the desk is a slate tablet scored with chalk marks, not words, patterns, circles and lines, coded symbols, simple enough to be memorized but rich in meaning. This was an early form of optical signalling, designed to be flashed from tower to tower with flags, mirrors, or lanterns. In times of siege, every second counted. A single flash could mean enemy spotted. 2 could mean riders dispatched. A short pattern might mean cut supply lines. These signals weren't improvisation. They were prearranged, rehearsed, and documented, as vital to defence as swords or boiling pitch. You walk to the window and peer through the slit. It's angled, not just downward but sideways as well, pointing toward a distant hill. From here you could flash light or wave cloth to another watchpost miles away. The line of sight isn't perfect, but it's close enough to carry news of life or death. And when distance grew too far for the eye, you reached for wings. In one corner of the room sits a dusty wooden cage. Inside you find tiny leather tubes, each the size of a child's finger. They're stained with ink, fragile with age. Pigeon message tubes. Rolled parchment was slid inside, the ends capped with wax or bone. Then the bird, already trained to return to its home loft, was released through a narrow slot in the window, cutting across sky and distance in ways no guard on foot ever could. And yes, sometimes those birds carried false messages. A clever lord might release 2 pigeons, one real, one fake. If the enemy intercepted the first, they'd be misled. The second would carry the truth to its destination. You turn back to the writing desk. A small glass vial still rests on the edge, once used to hold gall ink made from oak tree galls and iron salts. The letters scratched onto parchment here weren't lengthy. They didn't need to be. The code was the message. The castle's entire fate might hinge on 10 words or less. But what if those messages failed? What if the birds didn't return? Then the castle relied on foot messengers, runners trained to slip through siege, lines at night, carrying wax-sealed letters under their tongues or strapped inside hollowed-out shoes. One account tells of a stable boy who swam a half-frozen river in December, message in hand just to summon reinforcements. He made it. Barely. And changed the course of the siege. Because sometimes it wasn't walls that saved a castle. It was information. You sit down at the old desk. The wood creaks softly beneath your weight, and for a moment you imagine the scene. A scribe hunched here by candlelight, tongue between his teeth, scratching a message onto rough parchment while outside. Enemy torches flicker on the horizon. They're shouting in the courtyard, the stomp of boots on stone. He keeps writing. Because this was the castle's lifeline. The candle stub near your elbow is melted flat, its wax pooled and hardened across the tabletop. You trace it absent-mindedly, thinking about the nights where this very room decided whether help arrived or didn't. And here's a strange but true detail. Many castles had message tunnels carved into their walls, not for escape, but to shuttle notes between different parts of the keep during siege. Whisper holes too, small openings that let sound travel between rooms on separate floors. A servant in the kitchen could speak into a shaft, and the guard in the gatehouse would hear them. It wasn't magic. It was stone acoustics, exploited with the precision of an engineer. Some castles took it further. In northern Italy, one fortress built a full semaphore tower, centuries before Napoleon made the system famous. A rotating wooden arm was installed on the roof, manipulated from below to convey coded gestures over vast distances. It could only be seen in daylight, of course, but when clouds broke and vision returned, entire commands could pass between castles without a single word spoken. You rise from the chair and walk back into the corridor, footsteps soft now. This part of the keep feels quieter, not abandoned, just waiting. You spot a stair curling upward again. At the top, a bell tower. Smaller than the main watchtower, but no less important. In some castles, the warning bell was the most sacred object on site. Rung only in emergencies, and by order of the castellan or lord alone. Its tone was unmistakable, deep, sharp, heavy with iron and finality. And the strange part, it wasn't always for the defenders. Sometimes it was a psychological weapon. Imagine being a would-be invader sneaking through the woods or crawling through a trench, and suddenly the bell tolls, once, then again, then again. You freeze. You realize they've seen you. You hear the walls creak alive, the gates shut, the oil warmed, the archers summoned. That bell didn't just alert, it warned, and often that was enough. You descend again into a smaller hallway and spot a hatch on the wall, like a cabinet, only deeper. Inside, rows of wax-sealed message tubes, lined up like arrows. Some are labelled with places, others with names, all of them ready. Because even if the castle never saw war, it trained for one every day. You step away and pause beside a wooden panel with carvings, simple ones, a star, a hound, a crowned heart, not decoration. These were code markers, signs used by runners and messengers to indicate urgency, secrecy, or double meaning. If the wax was stamped with the crowned heart, for instance, it meant the message inside should be read only by the Lord. If it bore the hound, urgent, bloodshed imminent, you smile slightly. Because here, far from the outer gates and boiling oil, the castle fought a different kind of war. One of symbols, shadows, silence. And often, the quietest battle was the one that won. You leave the message room and step into a corridor you haven't seen before. Narrow, slightly sloped, and almost deliberately unremarkable. The stones here are smooth, the walls undecorated, and there's a stillness in the air that doesn't match the rest of the castle. No wind, no birds, just silence. And then, very faintly, you feel it. Air. Not from above, but from behind the wall. You press your hand to the stone. There's a gap, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. A thin seam runs vertically from floor to ceiling, just wide enough to mark the edge of something once hidden. You push, gently at first. Nothing. Then, with more weight. A quiet groan of wood and stone, and the wall gives, just slightly, revealing a hidden doorway no wider than your shoulders. You found it. A secret passage. Not every castle had them, but those that did treated them as sacred. These weren't fantasy tunnels lit with torches and velvet drapes. They were narrow, cramped, sometimes carved directly into the foundation, used not for luxury, but for escape, ambush, or spying. You step through. The air is colder here, damp, metallic, and still. Your shoulders brush both walls as you move, ducking slightly beneath a low ceiling. It's not quite dark either. A faint light trickles from pinholes overhead, disguised slits behind tapestries or the mouths of gargoyles outside the wall. In one castle in the Pyrenees, they say a lord escaped through a passage like this while his guests were still seated at dinner. Another castle in Saxony had 5 exits from a single tunnel, one leading to the stables, one to the forest, one to the village chapel, and 2 more never found again. These weren't just emergency exits, they were design threats, because an enemy couldn't plan for what they couldn't find. The mere rumour of a tunnel could unnerve a besieging army. Were the defenders already gone? Were they behind you? Were you the one being watched? You turn a tight corner. The path narrows even further, no more than 2 feet across, and then slopes downward. The floor is stone, worn but deliberate. Not natural. Someone made this. And then, something curious. A side alcove. It's tiny, barely the size of a cupboard, but carved deep into the wall. At the back of it, a small niche holds the remains of a lamp, oil-burned, soot-stained, still blackening the stone above. This was a listening point, a place where someone could sit, watch, and wait in silence. These were placed beneath great halls, behind chapels, even above staircases, not to escape, but to hear. You keep walking. Another corner, then another, and then the space widens. A small chamber opens before you, round, vaulted with 3 possible exits, a decision room. This is where the tunnel system becomes real. One route leads to a spiral stair rising back into the keep. Another slopes sharply toward the outer curtain wall, and the third, it disappears beneath the castle entirely. And here's the brilliant twist. Some of these tunnels were never meant to be used. They were fakes, decoys, traps. One French castle built a tunnel filled with iron spikes and dead ends, intended for use only if an enemy found it. Anyone who entered would be funneled deeper, only to find themselves trapped beneath a stone that couldn't be lifted from the inside. You choose the tunnel sloping outward, and keep walking. Because wherever it leads, one thing is certain. You're not supposed to be here. The tunnel slopes downward with a strange consistency, just steep enough to keep you cautious, not enough to panic. Your fingers trail the wall. It's damp, slimy in patches, and the air grows colder the further you go. Somewhere above, life continues in the castle. Fires are lit, gates opened, bread broken. But down here, this place belongs to secrecy. You pass another junction, this one blocked by a half-collapsed wall. The stones aren't shattered, but placed, as if someone wanted to seal the route without making it obvious. And in some cases they did. Lords sealed old escape tunnels once they were deemed unsafe or strategically irrelevant. Or worse, when they no longer trusted those inside the castle not to use them. You keep moving. The passage becomes rougher now, less polished. This part wasn't built for daily use. It's narrower, earthier. And then you hear it. Water. Not much, just a trickle, but it echoes through the tunnel like a whisper. You follow the sound. Around the next bend, the floor changes. No longer stone, packed dirt, spongy from groundwater. Roots creep along the walls, and then the tunnel opens into a wide vertical shaft, the walls slick with moss. You're standing at the edge of a hidden moat outlet, or perhaps a drainage chute, one of the lesser-known but absolutely essential features of a well-designed castle, the exit beneath the surface. It's here, in the filth and the dark, that the final act of genius reveals itself. Because the greatest castles didn't just prepare for victory, they prepared for retreat. Some exits were nothing more than grates, iron bars just wide enough to let water through, but also to allow a thin, determined body to crawl out. Others had removable panels, opened only from the inside by a hidden latch. In one Hungarian fortress, the mechanism was disguised as a stone relief of a lion's head, the mouth being the keyhole, unlocked only when a particular tile was pressed. Find that detail during a siege, you lived. Miss it, you died. You step closer to the grate. It's rusted now, bent slightly outward. Maybe someone used it, or tried. You peer through and see open air, grasses, mud, the slope of the outer hill. This is beyond the curtain wall. You've left the castle without ever being seen. And here's a thought that makes you pause. What if the escape was used in reverse? History is full of stories where traitors opened tunnels from inside, where attackers bribed a servant or tortured a map from a messenger. In one chilling case in Brittany, a tunnel like this was used not for escape, but for entry. 50 men crawled through sewage and slime, emerging in the undercroft to sack the keep from below. The defenders had forgotten it even existed. You crouch and touch the rim of the tunnel exit. There are notches here, carved faintly into the stone, as if made by fingernails or knives. Maybe someone hesitated here. Maybe someone turned back. Because once you leave through a tunnel like this, you're gone. You abandon the walls, the stone, the warmth, the structure. You become part of the forest, the dark, the unknown. You stand and turn back into the passage. This time you take the stair that leads up, and once again the castle swallows your footsteps. It never saw you leave, and it never asked where you'd been. You emerge from the tunnel stair in a part of the castle you haven't visited yet, a quiet vaulted wing tucked behind the main hall. The air feels different. Not colder, Not warmer, but heavier somehow. Stone here is smoother, more deliberate. The windows are taller, stained by soot, but clearly once kept clean. The door frames are carved with care. This isn't a place for defence, it's a place for ritual. You've stepped into the castle chapel. Sunlight filters through a high lancet window, painting long fingers of dusty gold across the stone floor. You walk softly now, not out of reverence, but because something about this space asks for quiet. Even when empty, chapels like this held weight. Here, alliances were sealed, oaths were sworn, and secrets too were kept. But this chapel, like everything else in the castle, served more than one purpose. You pass the stone altar. It's plain, undecorated. A small cross still stands at its centre, tilted just slightly, its base fused to the stone by centuries of melted candle wax. Behind it, a wall tapestry has long since crumbled, leaving nothing but iron hooks and a faded outline, and beneath your feet, a carved stone slab, one among many, because in many castles the chapel doubled as a crypt. Lords, ladies, and favoured knights were buried beneath the altar floor, sometimes with honour, sometimes simply out of convenience. One castle in Cornwall had over 24 burial slabs beneath its chapel, some stacked too deep when space ran short during plague. You step forward again, and now you begin to see it, the defensive logic hidden in devotion. The chapel in most castles was placed at the heart of the keep, not by accident. Its central location made it defensible, protected by stone on every side, and not just spiritually. In some castles there were arrow slits carved behind altar panels, hidden behind tapestries or decorative screens. The chapel was a sanctuary, yes, but also a fallback point. The last stone before surrender, and then there's the upper gallery. You spot a spiral stair in the corner and ascend quietly. At the top, a narrow balcony runs along the chapel's rear wall. It was meant for noble families to observe Mass above the common crowd. But it also offered a clear line of sight across the nave, and beyond through a series of cleverly angled slits into the bailey outside. A lookout post disguised as piety. In one siege in Normandy, the chapel gallery was turned into a sniper's nest. Crossbowmen fired down through specially cut loopholes, using the altar itself as cover. They didn't care that it was holy. When the walls cracked and the grain spoiled, even sanctity became tactical. And then there's the floor. You kneel to examine one flagstone near the entry. Smooth, darker than the rest. It rocks slightly under your touch. Lift it, and you'd find what many did in desperate times. A tunnel, or a stair, or a simple stone vault used to hide scrolls, relics, or people. One Spanish castle hid its own chapel priest here for 3 years during a civil war. They fed him through a hole in the wall. He never spoke again after he emerged. You sit for a moment on the chapel bench, worn and bowed under centuries of weight. Sunlight still pours in, dust still floats, and all around you the silence watches. Because in this castle, even the chapel was part of the plan. You remain seated in the chapel a moment longer, listening. Not for footsteps or bells or distant cries from the walls, but for the quiet things. The creak of settling timber high in the rafters, the hush of wind pressing against the stained glass, the subtle drip of water down a cold seam in the wall. Even silence here has a structure. You rise, stepping softly past the pews and toward the rear wall of the chapel, where another door waits. It's smaller than most, made of dark oak and bound with iron. It doesn't creak. It simply opens, quietly, obediently. On the other side is a short hallway lined with niches carved into the walls. Each one once held a candle, perhaps a relic. But more than that, this passage led somewhere important. The priest's quarters, or at least That's what it would seem. But like everything else in this castle, these rooms wore multiple masks. You enter a small chamber, bare stone walls, a writing desk, a low bed frame against the far side. A shelf holds the remains of manuscripts, their vellum curled and brittle, their ink faded into ghostly strokes. But look closer. Beneath the desk is a recess in the wall, its edge smoother than it should be. You press gently. It clicks. A panel swings open, revealing a viewing slit cut into the side of the chapel. From here, someone could watch without being seen. Not for worship, not for prayer, but for observation. Because the chapel was not always a place of peace. It was often the one place where enemies would be welcomed into the heart of the keep, under the guise of diplomacy, marriage talks, or sacred negotiation. And the castle, clever as ever, made sure someone was always watching. But it didn't stop there. Beneath the priest's chamber there was often a hidden vault, not for gold, not even for relics, but for records. Charters, deeds, letters, lists of who owed what to whom. The spiritual authority of the castle often overlapped with its legal muscle, and in times of invasion those parchments were worth more than coin. If you ruled the records, you ruled the land. You descend a few steps into a cramped square room. The smell here is sharper, ink and dust and old oil. A slanted writing lectern still rests in the centre. Nearby, a tiny brazier, long since cold, used to warm wax seals or fingers gone stiff with age. Some castles had entire scriptoriums tucked beneath their chapels, copying texts even while war raged above. One such scriptorium in Flanders was shielded during a siege by a curtain wall no one knew existed, just to protect 5 monks and a set of land grants, and sometimes there were darker things hidden here. Torture devices? Rarely. But confession records, sealed away from prying eyes, written in shorthand, stored in lead-lined boxes. Knowledge was power, and confession, especially the whispered kind offered during siege, with death pressing in on every side, was the most dangerous power of all. You return to the chapel above, stepping once more beneath the stone ribs of the vaulted ceiling. You glance at the cross, still tilted, still watching, and it hits you. Even the place built for mercy had a role in war. Even the chapel had layers of defence, and in a castle like this there were no empty rooms. Only rooms with secrets. You step back into the main corridor, the chapel's hush still clinging to your clothes like candle smoke. But now the silence shifts, less sacred, more practical. The hallway widens. The air grows busier, heavier, as if memories still bustle through these stones, trailing linen and clattering keys. You've reached a part of the castle often overlooked in battle songs and knightly poems. The women's domain, not a boudoir, not a sewing circle. This was the command centre of logistics, and at its heart stood the lady of the castle. You enter a chamber tucked near the solar, not grand but central. This is where she worked. A long table stretches beneath a narrow window, covered in what remains of ledgers, pins, cracked wax seals. On the wall, hooks for keys, dozens of them, each one labelled, each one meant for a chest, a storeroom, a gate, or a cellar door. Because while the lord might lead the defence, it was the castellan's wife, or widow, or daughter, who kept the walls alive. You move past a shelf lined with rolled parchment, not religious texts, inventories, grain counts, fabric stocks, lists of candle stubs, barrel lids, preserved eggs. Siege wasn't won with arrows alone. It was won by who had wool socks in winter, who had dried mint to treat dysentery, who remembered that flour needs more than just a mill. It needs to be guarded from rats. In many castles, the lady of the house was trained from childhood not in music and dancing, but in provisioning. She knew how to ration honey, how to stretch beef into stew, how to spot a weak beam in the granary that might buckle under the weight of wet barley. When war came, she became the general of the interior, and yes, she fought. In Scotland, one lady held her tower for 6 months, commanding crossbowmen, organising repairs, keeping morale up while her husband lay rotting in an enemy cell. In France, a noblewoman famously disguised herself as a maid to sneak through the siege lines and rally reinforcements. She didn't carry a sword, she carried orders. You pass into the adjoining room, a kind of war pantry, wooden boxes filled with beeswax, charcoal, soap, dried herbs. Some were for daily use, others were part of what the castle called the siege stores, supplies held back, hidden from common view, meant to be used only in the worst days. And here's where things get truly ingenious. Behind a hanging tapestry, you find what looks like a broom cupboard. But open the door, and you see a winding staircase, barely wide enough for one person. It leads downward, not to the kitchens, but to servant pathways, designed to let the lady's orders travel invisibly. These passageways let runners carry word from tower to tower, from pantry to chapel, without being seen. Because information was as valuable as food, and in many castles it was the lady who knew everything, who was where, who was late, who spoke out of turn, who hid supplies, who opened a door they shouldn't have. She knew, because she watched, and because the castle itself helped her. You glance back at the table. Scratched into the wood are faint notches, marks of counting maybe. Siege days, ration units, or just someone keeping time in silence, while above, the walls braced for war. You descend the narrow servant stair, still warm from the memories of that chamber. The scent of beeswax and ink, the soft scrape of parchment against stone. Down here, the air tightens again. It smells like lye soap, dry cloth, and old wood. You've entered the service arteries of the castle, where the invisible work of survival happened. The stair deposits you into a tight hallway that branches off into several smaller rooms. Each was once part of a network carefully overseen by the lady of the keep. These weren't just kitchens and storerooms. They were stations in a system, each with a purpose, each connected by runners, keys, and absolute memory. You step into the laundry, where stone basins still rest beneath an arched window, their edges worn smooth by hundreds of scrubbing hands. The floor slants slightly to one side, directing soapy water into a thin channel. But this wasn't just for clean linens. Laundries were places where information was gathered, where whispers spread. Servants gossiped, notes were passed, and the lady? She listened. Above the hearth hangs a length of knotted rope. A drying line, yes, but also once used to signal orders. A particular knot tied in a specific place might indicate a laundry run delayed by lack of ash soap, or that the soap itself had been rationed. Even in fabric there was code. You move to another room, smaller, with walls of shelves now empty. This was the herb room, overseen by women trained not just in cooking, but in remedy and poison. Dried rosemary, sage, rue, comfrey. Some were for poultices, some were for soups, and some were for more final purposes, because the lady of the castle also oversaw the apothecary chest, often kept locked in her personal quarters. Within it, wormwood, henbane, powdered lead, belladonna. Nothing extravagant. Just enough to end a spy, or ease the death of a wounded ally. The line between healing and harming blurred quickly when the gates were shut. You pass into a third room, wide, low-ceilinged, and built into the thickest part of the wall. This was the command pantry. In siege times it was where the lady directed not soldiers, but provisions. You can still see chalk marks on the wall. A grid, once used to track what remained. Bread, salt, dried peas. How many days left? She would have stood here, flanked by scribes and stewards, deciding who ate, who waited, who didn't. And now, for the most delicate truth, when the Lord died, or was away, it was she who held the ring of keys, not just to doors, but to every choice that followed. Who was allowed in? What corridor was sealed? Whether to surrender or resist one more night. Some castles even had formal documents drawn in advance, naming the lady as deputy commander during times of absence, and she took it seriously, because no one knew better how to stretch a sack of grain, or how to smuggle a message, or when to tell the cook to stop salting meat and start hiding it. And here's a quiet, astonishing detail. In one Irish stronghold, a noblewoman defending her keep instructed her servants to burn their own hair and mix it with boiling tar, to make it cling longer when thrown from the walls. Her enemies remembered her long after the stones fell. You leave the service wing now, retracing the stair you came down, and as you rise the light returns. And so does the awareness that behind every drawbridge and portcullis there was someone, quietly calculating, unseen and entirely essential, keeping the whole world from falling apart. You emerge into a side courtyard now, tucked away behind the main keep. The sun breaks briefly through the clouds, casting pale golden light across worn cobblestones and timber doorways. A wooden cart stands half-loaded with firewood. Chickens scatter beneath a bench. A thread of smoke curls from a low chimney. This is not a place of war. This is a place of rhythm. You've entered the working core of the castle, the domain of servants, stewards, stable boys, and cooks, a world that rarely appears in tales of sieges and banners, and yet without it the rest of the fortress would collapse within days. It begins with a sound, the metallic clang of a ladle striking iron. From across the yard a door opens and a young man in rough linen emerges carrying a sack of grain, muttering under his breath. His path crosses a washerwoman hauling damp sheets. She nods. He nods. No words. Just motion. It's all muscle memory now. Because a castle wasn't just defended by stone, it was sustained by routine. You pass a row of storage huts, each one neatly labelled with crude symbols. A sheaf of wheat, a pickaxe, a boot. These were part of the castle's logistics system, a decentralised network overseen by the reeve and the ladies' stewards. Goods didn't just sit idle, they rotated. Apples were checked daily, cheese turned, casks of ale tapped slowly to track spoilage. You slip through a low door into the bakehouse. The air is thick and yeasty. A stone oven squats in the corner, its mouth black with ash. On the counter lies a row of flat loaves, tough and dry, siege bread, made with coarse flour and just enough water to bind it. It'll last for weeks, months if buried in ash. And here's a quiet genius. Bakers often hid messages in loaves, small slips of waxed parchment baked into the crust, sent between towers, kitchens, even spies in the garrison. If you found the right loaf and knew where to crack it, you'd find news, orders, maybe even a route out. You return to the yard and follow a curved path past the stables. The animals are fewer now. During siege, many would be slaughtered early for meat or moved to inner pens, but the structure remains. A hayloft, a wheel of ropes used for drawing water, and the smell, sour, earthy, alive. You enter the brewhouse next. The stone basin still smells of hops and damp wood. Beer was safer to drink than water. Even children drank weak ale. And the castle couldn't run dry, not because people needed to celebrate, but because hydration mattered. Here, yeast was a survival tool. You pause near a small doorway and notice something strange. A ledger scratched into the wall itself. Not parchment, not ink. Just shallow lines in the plaster, tracking days, rations, who worked which shift. Why? Because in siege, parchment might be burned, ink might be spilled. but the wall remained. You step out again and notice a child, a girl, maybe 10 or 11, scrubbing a bucket near the well. She sings quietly, badly, but the tune is steady. She doesn't see you, because here in the very heart of the castle's machine no one stops moving. They can't, because as long as the gears turn, fires lit, bread baked, water drawn, the castle holds. You move past the well and toward a narrower alley, where the cobblestones grow slick with kitchen grease and spilled broth. This is the waste path, the quiet artery that carried the castle's least glorious burden. Buckets of slop, ash from fires, bones gnawed clean, even excrement carried in sealed barrels to be dumped beyond the walls or buried deep in hidden pits. And yet, even this part of the castle was touched by brilliance. Hidden just beyond the wall is a latrine tower, called a garderobe. It juts out precariously over the cliffside, its chute leading straight down into open air or a pit below. To the enemy it's an afterthought, but to the architect it's a defensive advantage. When enemies scaled the wall, they sometimes met more than arrows. Sometimes they met the contents of the garderobe, poured directly onto their heads. Siege warfare, after all, had no rules about dignity. You peek inside the garderobe and spot an old superstition scratched into the wall, a protective charm against demons. Because even in practical places the old fears lingered. People believed that the toilet was a portal, a vulnerable place where evil might enter the body, and so many garderobes had carved faces or holy symbols placed just above the seat, like a stone guardian watching as you relieved yourself. Back in the main yard, you follow a low tunnel that once connected to the ice house. It's dark and damp even now. Blocks of winter-cut ice were packed in straw and stored underground to cool perishables during the warmer months. In castles lucky enough to have one, the ice house meant milk lasted days longer, fish didn't rot, and nobles could sip wine that wasn't lukewarm. That's the thing about this part of the castle. The part behind the glamour. It was full of quiet technologies. A barrel with a false bottom could smuggle meat, or messages. A kitchen knife etched with runes might have belonged to a cook who also moonlighted as a healer. Even the ash pits held secrets. Buried coins, broken charms, a whistle made from a bird bone. You reach the tannery, set farthest from the main halls for good reason. The stench is thick, acidic, meaty, unforgettable. But tanning was crucial. Without leather there were no belts, no boots, no bindings for books. In siege times, old boots were boiled for glue or eaten outright. Leather, once luxury, became sustenance, and now, through a slatted door, you return to the servants' hall. Long benches, clay jugs, a fire that's still warm. You picture the workers gathered here at the end of another grinding day. They talk in low voices, trade scraps, maybe slip a flask around. They were the memory of the castle, these servants. They knew who slept where, who snuck out, who whispered to whom behind the garden wall. And one day, when the banners were taken down and the family gone, it was often the servants who kept the castle standing, who patched roofs, who lit candles in the empty chapel, who held stories in their bones. There's an old rumour in Normandy that a castle long thought ruined still breathed through its caretaker, a woman who, for 40 years, walked the halls at dusk, touching every door, whispering the names of those long dead. They say the mice never returned while she was there. You glance once more at the scuffed flagstones beneath your feet, at the soot-stained hearth and the cracked window panes. This is where the castle lived, not in the towers, here in the humble heartbeat of its people. You step out from the warmth of the servants' hall and into the bite of the evening air. The sun has slipped low now, casting long amber shadows across the inner ward. But you're not done yet. You look upward. High above, jutting from the highest walls, you see narrow platforms, slits in the stone, wooden galleries that overhang the battlements. These were no afterthought. They were part of the castle's final layer of protection. You're heading to the machicolations, up a spiralling stair again. Your legs protest now, and the stone steps are narrower than before. They were made this way on purpose. Defenders had the advantage. Attackers were slowed, pressed inward, forced to wield weapons awkwardly. You emerge onto the parapet. The wind snaps colder up here. Before you stretch the castle walls like the spine of a great stone beast. And underneath your feet, those gaps in the floor. That's where things got interesting. Machicolations were overhanging murder holes, slots between stone supports that let defenders drop anything on attackers below. Hot sand, boiling oil, rocks, in a pinch, even beehives. Yes, that's a real trick from the annals of a Hungarian siege. The defenders loosed bees onto the attackers swarming below. From this perch, a small force could hold off a much larger one for days, even weeks. Arrows could be fired from above. Boiling pitch could be poured directly through those floor gaps. Imagine being down there, no cover, no way to scale the smooth wall, and a rain of scalding brine falling from invisible slits in the sky. And that's only the vertical defence. You lean out carefully and notice the crenellations, those classic castle tooth shapes, also called battlements. From behind each stone merlon, an archer could fire with cover. The open gaps, called embrasures, allowed a clear shot. But what makes it even more brilliant? These patterns were often angled or staggered, creating overlapping fields of fire. You couldn't approach one side of the wall without coming under fire from two others. Suddenly a gust of wind rips across the parapet, catching your cloak, or at least it would have, had you been wearing one like the guards once did. But they would have known better. Cloaks up here got caught. So they wore short coats, tightly belted, and stayed low. They knew every inch of this wall. And if they didn't, the wall remembered. Many castles had grooves carved into the stones where sentries rested their crossbows or lined up their pikes. Little notches, marks of repetition, of centuries of hands gripping the same points, like fingerprints in the architecture. You walk the parapet and your foot finds a depression, just slightly worn, a sentry post. They stood there, hour after hour, watching the tree line, the road, the river. Some carved initials into the stone with a dagger. Some sang. Some went mad from silence. But all of them knew this. The top of the wall was not just a final line of defence. It was the throat of the castle, and when it roared, even armies trembled. You continue along the parapet, moving cautiously. The wind has picked up, tugging at your sleeves, and the horizon glows with the deepening gold of sunset. You glance down. Far below, the outer curtain wall curves in a gentle arc, enclosing the world within. But here, up high, you're walking through the final orchestra of medieval engineering. You reach a small watch turret, barely more than a stone booth perched on the corner of the wall. Step inside, and the wind softens. The air stills. You can almost hear the echoes of boots scraping and guards murmuring as they huddled here during long winter nights. Carved into the stone wall beside you is a message in Latin, scratched faintly by a tired hand. He who sleeps dies. A grim reminder that atop these walls, vigilance was life. But this wasn't just a place for sentries, it was a place of decisions. From this turret, the commander could see everything. The fields beyond the moat, the bridges that twisted through the hills, the treetops that concealed both danger and hope. And in some castles, especially along the Welsh marches or the Scottish borders, this was where the beacon fire was lit. One spark, one flare of smoke, and the next tower down the line would answer, then the next, then the next. A chain of castles miles apart could signal a full invasion in minutes. Primitive? Maybe, but breathtakingly effective. You leave the turret and continue toward the next corner of the wall, where something odd catches your eye. A recessed chamber built into the stone, smaller than a room, larger than a cupboard. You peer in. Hooks on the walls, a rusted chain, and in the back, a narrow trapdoor in the floor, once leading to the level below. This is a drop chamber, part of a rare vertical system where defenders could lower weapons, or oil cauldrons, or even entire guards down by rope into the walkway below. A tactical elevator, in a sense, centuries before such a thing became common. In certain Italian fortresses they went further, designing wheeled wooden sleds to slide down rails between towers, allowing supplies and even injured soldiers to move across the upper levels without exposing themselves to enemy archers. Now you notice the roofline. Not all castles had flat walls. Some had sloped tiles designed to send arrows glancing off or funnel rainwater away. In Normandy, some castles even had drain spouts shaped like gargoyles, not just to keep walls dry but to frighten attackers. Because fear, after all, was a weapon too. And speaking of fear, beneath your feet lies the postern gate. A small secret door hidden within the wall itself, used for escape or sudden counterattacks. It could be the difference between capture and survival, and it was always watched, always doubted. Some commanders had it bricked over during siege, others used it to change history. One story tells of a castle in Languedoc that held out for 6 weeks, until one stormy night, a boy from the kitchen slipped through the postern gate and lit a torch in the enemy camp, pretending to signal betrayal. The attackers panicked, withdrew, and the castle never fell. Now the sun is nearly gone. Shadows climb the walls around you. You pause for one last look. The high walls, the slits, the curves, the crests. They weren't just for show. They were defence layered upon defence, sharpened by genius and desperate need. And you've walked every inch of it. From here you descend once more, but your heart stays at the top. Because now you know, the genius of a medieval castle wasn't in its glamour. It was in its refusal to fall. The stone beneath your boots is uneven again, smoothed by time, bowed by weight. You've descended from the walls and now walk along the inner passageways, deeper toward the heart of the keep. The air grows quieter here, heavier. It's not the silence of sleep, it's the silence of command. You're entering the war room. The great hall is long abandoned, its fire pit cold, but the bones of strategy still linger. Here is where the lords and captains once gathered, not to eat, not to dance, but to prepare for the unthinkable. This wasn't the banquet chamber you saw before. This room had maps etched into wood, with pebbles for armies and bones for enemies. There were no decorations, only weapons, plans, and weathered voices arguing into the night. And in this space the castle's true brain revealed itself, not in stone, not in boiling oil, but in decisions made under pressure. You approach a table with carved grooves, once used to hold wax seals and strategic stones. A scrap of old leather, forgotten, lies in the corner. If you flipped it over, you might see scribbled runes, coded orders written in a form only 3 men in the fortress could understand. This was not the glamour of banners. This was cold calculation. And outside that door, the deadliest invention of all, the false retreat path. Some castles, particularly in France and Spain, had interior courtyards with fake gates. At a glance, they looked like exits. In panic, attackers might flood into them, thinking they had breached the keep. But the walls would curve inward, narrowing until they funneled into a trap chamber, where archers waited above, and escape was impossible. You wouldn't know it was a trap until the screams began. You cross to the other side of the war room and enter a narrower corridor, a place where the stones begin to sweat, and your steps echo with a strange finality. The chapel. Yes, even here, amid war and stone, faith had a room. But this one wasn't for show. It wasn't gilded or grand. It was made for siege. The benches were short. The cross was iron. The candles, stumpy and reused. This was where soldiers confessed before battle, where lords wept in secret, and where, if the castle fell, some hid their children, hoping for a miracle. And sometimes miracles happened, because this chapel had a hidden stair, a narrow slot behind the altar, shielded by a false panel, leading downward into the rock. Some say it led to a cavern, others to the river. One legend tells of a woman who carried her baby through it, guided only by the glow of moss growing along the tunnel walls. She emerged 2 miles away, barefoot but alive. You leave the chapel and pass beneath a stone arch where the old banners still hang, tattered, sun-bleached, smelling of old iron. The coat of arms is faded, but you trace its outline, 3 ravens on a field of red. You wonder if anyone still remembers what they stood for. Probably not. But the stone remembers, because this part of the castle, this inner sanctum of strategy, traps, and belief, that's where the genius lay deepest. In quiet rooms, in secret tunnels, in the decisions made not with swords, but with whispers and candlelight. The corridor curves again, narrowing like the inside of a throat, and your shoulders brush the walls. You're entering what was once the most restricted part of the entire fortress, the treasury and vaults, where the lifeblood of the castle wasn't just protected by stone and secrecy, but by ingenuity that could humble any would-be thief. The air grows stiller, dust motes swirl in your lantern light, and ahead, a wooden door with iron bands looms, plain, yet unnaturally thick. This was no ordinary storeroom. This was the stronghold within the stronghold. Behind this door once lay the castle's coin chest, jewels, documents, and sometimes hostages. Yes, in certain sieges, especially during the 100 Years' War, noble children were kept here as guarantees of future alliances. Protected, yes, but also deeply watched. And how did they secure it? With double keys, of course, one held by the lord, the other by the steward. But more than that, some castles designed the vault chamber with tilting floors or false flagstones. Step on the wrong one, the slab would dip just enough to trigger a silent alert upstairs, or in some tales drop the unlucky intruder into a pit of spikes, or a chamber with no way out. You pass into the room and glance up. There's a square hole in the ceiling. A pulley used to hang sacks of coin from the rafters. Why? To make it harder to steal from below, or to lower messages directly into the treasury from the war room above without ever opening the door. Even in defence they thought in 3 dimensions. You move on, deeper into the bowels of the keep. Another hallway splits and bends. Here you find the records vault. Parchments in sealed alcoves, iron scroll boxes and hollow pillars. One fringe tale from Bohemia tells of a castle where the pillar bases were used to hide sovereign rings and forged decrees, sealed in beeswax and stuffed deep inside hollowed stone. Some castles had roof-tile code systems. One cracked tile at a certain point meant open the tunnel, 2 meant burn the orders. And no one but the steward and the lord scribe knew the full pattern. It's this level of planning, not brute strength, that made a medieval castle nearly impossible to conquer from within. It wasn't just about moats and arrows, it was about layers, illusions, rituals. You turn a final corner and reach a small square room with a grated drain at the centre. The floor is sloped ever so slightly toward it. No tapestries here, no windows, just a metal collar bolted to the far wall, now rusted through. This was the interrogation room, though in some castles it was disguised as a pantry. And while we won't dwell here long, there's a reason it was located deep and far from any guests' earshot. Some prisoners left this room only through the drain. Yet beside this grim relic, in a little wall niche, sits something softer. A wooden cup, worn smooth with use. Carved on its side, a prayer. He who endures, returns. Perhaps it was left by a jailer, or perhaps more hauntingly by one who came back to tell the tale. You leave the vaults quietly, rejoining the upper halls where torchlight still licks the stone. And as you walk, you feel it. This place was not a single structure. It was a nervous system, pulsing with strategy, hiding the most brilliant ideas in its darkest corners. And just when you think you've uncovered the castle's final secret, you reach the last door. The final door stands before you, arched and ancient. It's unlike the others you've passed. No iron bands, no carvings, no heavy bolts or hinges, just smooth, worn oak fitted tightly into a stone frame, as if the castle itself grew around it like a shell. You reach for the handle, hesitant. There's something about this door that feels different, and as it creaks open, you realize why. You're not stepping into another defensive corridor or secret vault. You're stepping into memory. This chamber isn't made for battle. It was never meant to repel invaders or hide treasure. It's circular, lined with narrow seats carved into the stone. At the center, a shallow depression filled once with water, a reflecting basin, now dry and cracked. The air is still, almost reverent. This was the council chamber, the innermost circle of trust. Here, the Lord and their most trusted advisors would meet. When everything else had failed, when the siege dragged into its 4th month, when food was scarce and hope scarcer. And here, in the faintest flicker of candlelight, the decisions were made that could alter the fate of a generation. No guard stood here, only oaths. No banners flew, only whispers. This is where the castle's human genius lay, not in weapons, not in walls, but in people. In the agreements, betrayals, alliances and sacrifices that kept the keep standing, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. You run your fingers along the edge of the basin and feel the groove where someone once traced the rim, again and again in deep thought. Perhaps during a siege, perhaps just before surrender, or worse, just before opening the postern gate under cover of fog. The candles here would have been few, the robes heavy, the air thick with the weight of decisions no one wanted to make. And then, just behind one of the stone seats, your fingers catch something faint, a carved line, no more than a scratch. But as you tilt your head, the light reveals it clearly, a circle within a circle, an ancient symbol of protection, placed here by someone long before this castle rose. A superstition, maybe, but maybe it's something else. An echo of the idea that defence begins long before the first stone is laid. That the real brilliance of a castle lies not just in architecture, but in what its people believed it could withstand. You stand now, facing the room alone, and imagine the voices, the arguments, the silences, the final decisions. And one day, when the gates did fall, and the enemy flooded through the courtyard and the walls were lost, this was likely the last room left untouched, the one place where silence finally won. You exit through the same door, but instead of retracing your steps, you take a left turn, into a tunnel so narrow you must turn sideways. The stone is slick, the air cold. You're moving under the castle now, toward the most brilliant secret of all. Because for every tower that stood tall, there was always a way out. Your footsteps echo faintly as you descend, deeper than you thought the foundations went. The walls close in, slick with moss and centuries of forgotten air, and then suddenly the tunnel opens into a vaulted chamber, rough-hewn, wet with condensation, and carved straight into the bedrock. You found the escape route, the final stroke of genius, Every castle that could afford it, every builder who dared to dream past stone and siege, secretly carved a tunnel like this. The sally port, the back door no enemy was supposed to know existed. It might lead to a cave, a forest, or the bed of a dry river. It might stretch a mile or more. Some were only big enough for a single person crawling on hands and knees. Others, like this one, could fit a small procession of horses if needed. But they all served the same purpose: survival through vanishing. And of course, no one left this way lightly. These tunnels weren't grand. They were damp, tight, and terrifying. You had to crouch. Sometimes you had to drag yourself. And they didn't just lead to freedom, they led to uncertainty. Because once you fled, your home was gone. Still, they existed. Quiet masterpieces of engineering shrouded in myth. Some say they were designed not by the Lord's own architects, but by monks, or even disgraced masons paid in gold and sworn to secrecy. There's a story from a castle in Hungary where the escape tunnel was hidden behind the hearth of a kitchen oven. When the enemy surrounded the keep, the cook baked bread as usual, then lifted the fire grate and led 3 children and a priest into the tunnel, disappearing just as the gates fell. To this day, no one knows where it ends. You move forward slowly, noticing the way the tunnel subtly slopes downward, drawing water away, and how the sides flare at certain points, not for beauty, but to allow air to circulate, so those fleeing wouldn't suffocate before reaching the exit. Now and then, faint marks catch your eye. Chisel scratches, initials, or tally marks from someone who counted the minutes or the prayers as they crawled. One mark stands out: 4 vertical slashes crossed by a 5th. A count, a memory, perhaps a promise to return. At last the tunnel narrows again, then widens one final time into a chamber with stone benches carved into the sides. A place to rest or wait for nightfall. It's here, under the weight of 1,000 tons of fortress, that you begin to understand the full brilliance of what's been built. Not just stone walls, not just clever traps, but a complete ecosystem designed to endure, deceive, defend, and if needed, disappear. You turn back slowly, knowing this is the final chamber, the final breath of the castle's living body. Above you lie curtain walls, arrow loops, sloped keeps, spiral stairs, murder holes, and towers, each with their own genius, each a layered testament to human fear, pride, hope, and brilliance. But down here, this is the part they never bragged about. The part hidden behind altars, ovens, and carved stone benches. The part that whispered, even if we fall, we can still vanish. And now, as you return through the tunnel, let the dust settle behind you. Let the torches burn low. Let the castle in all its brilliance sleep once more. You've walked its highest ramparts and its deepest truths, and you made it out alive. The castle is behind you now, resting in the hush of memory. Its towers blur against the night sky. The ramparts no longer ring with boots. The gates no longer groan on their hinges. The moat lies still, and all the secrets, those carved into stone, hidden behind hearths, or whispered in candlelit council chambers, settle into silence. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop like the drawbridge after the last sentry turns in. You've wandered through a marvel of human effort. Walls built not just to keep enemies out, but to hold families, hopes, and legacies within. You felt the cold of the stones, the weight of the stairs, the tightness of the hidden tunnel, and the quiet brilliance behind every slit in the wall and every trap below your feet. And now, it's time to drift. Imagine yourself wrapped in a heavy wool cloak, curled in a corner of the great hall before a dying fire. The torches flicker low. The night wind hums beyond the arrow loops, but in here, it's safe. It's still. The castle breathes around you, old but enduring, quiet but strong. Let your heart beat slow. Let your breath match the rhythm of history, rolling gently through time like a banner in the breeze. You've been part of something ancient tonight, and now you rest, protected, like those who once slept behind the walls you walked.